The Richard Paradox says that some numbers can be uniquely described using a finite number of words, while others cannot. But the paradox itself creates a contradiction by trying to describe a number that supposedly cannot be described in a finite number of words. Imagine a list of all possible definitions that can be written in a single sentence using a fixed set of words. This list would include descriptions of many numbers, like the smallest prime number, or the largest number less than 100 that is divisible by both 7 and 9. I'd love to invite you to share in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It's incredible to think about how we're all connected through these stories and ideas. If you enjoy these thought-provoking explorations, consider subscribing to Tired Thinker so we can keep bringing you reflective narratives. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let your imagination drift as we delve into the mind-boggling paradoxes and mysteries. Every number on the list has a clear definition in a limited number of words. Now consider the phrase, the smallest number that cannot be described in fewer than 20 words. If such a number exists, then the phrase itself describes it in fewer than 20 words. That means the number can, in fact, be described in a limited number of words, contradicting the original statement. If the number truly required more than 20 words, then the phrase should not be able to describe it. The paradox arises because defining something as indescribable in a clear and structured way invalidates its supposed indescribability. Another way to look at this problem is through self-reference. It's similar to saying, this sentence is false. If the sentence is false, then it must be true, but if it's true, then it must be false. The Richard Paradox works the same way by constructing a description of a number that claims it cannot be described. This logical loop makes it impossible to resolve the problem without contradicting itself. A practical way to understand this is by thinking about how we classify numbers. Some numbers, like 7 or 1000, are simple to describe. Others, such as the 17th prime number or the smallest number that requires 100 digits to write, can be described with effort, but still in a finite way. The paradox suggests that beyond a certain level of complexity, there are numbers that cannot be uniquely defined with short descriptions. However, as soon as one is pointed out as the first number that cannot be described briefly, that very description becomes a brief definition of the number. This paradox ties into computability and the limits of language. In mathematics, definitions often work within formal systems. If a number is said to be undefinable, then by definition it should not be possible to refer to it uniquely. But as soon as we describe it in terms of its supposed indefinability, it enters into the realm of things that have definitions. This logical contradiction suggests a fundamental issue with how language and mathematics interact. One implication of this paradox is that there are limits to self-referential descriptions in formal logic. It resembles problems found in Gödel's incompleteness theorems, where certain statements within a system can be true but cannot be proven within that system. The Richard Paradox shows that some numbers might be logically impossible to define, yet the moment we attempt to discuss them in these terms, they become defined. This paradox also highlights problems in the philosophy of language. Words and definitions rely on context. When someone says, "This sentence is unprovable," they are making a claim about language that interacts with itself. If a definition depends on its own indefinability, then it collapses under contradiction. This suggests that language, when pushed to certain limits, fails to be consistent. A way to grasp the paradox is by considering a library that tries to catalog all books that describe numbers. The librarian wants to keep a record of all books that define numbers in fewer than 20 words. Eventually, they find a number that doesn't seem to have a book describing it in that limit. So they create a book titled "The Smallest Number Not Describable in Fewer Than 20 Words." But now, this book exists, and it describes the number in fewer than 20 words. This means the number did not belong to the original group, contradicting its classification. This contradiction appears in various logical and mathematical discussions. In computer science, it resembles problems with self-replicating programs and the limits of defining information. If a system tries to define the smallest uncomputable number, then by defining it, the system inadvertently makes it computable. Thinking about the paradox in everyday terms, consider a contest where people submit the shortest unique description of a number. The judges rule that any description must be under 20 words. Suppose someone submits the smallest number not describable in fewer than 20 words. If the judges accept this as valid, then the number has been described in fewer than 20 words, contradicting the claim. If they reject it, then they must argue that the phrase is not actually a description of a number, which raises deeper questions about what counts as a definition. This paradox is an example of how self-referential problems create logical contradictions. In mathematics, formal logic tries to avoid these contradictions by limiting the way definitions can refer to themselves. But in natural language, it is difficult to avoid these loops. The Richard paradox, like many similar paradoxes, shows the problems that arise when language, logic, and numbers interact in unexpected ways. While the paradox may seem abstract, it raises practical issues in logic, mathematics, and even artificial intelligence. When designing a system to categorize or define things, one must be careful about self-referential problems. If a program were told to list all numbers that cannot be defined concisely, it would encounter the same contradiction when it inevitably has to define one of them concisely. This problem is also related to the idea of limits in human knowledge. If we assume that some things are unknowable, then the moment we specify what is unknowable, we seem to contradict ourselves. This suggests that the boundary between the known and the unknown is not always clear-cut. The paradox forces a reconsideration of how definitions work. It also raises questions about infinity, complexity, and meaning. If numbers truly exist beyond definition, how do we even discuss them? And if any number we mention becomes defined, does that mean that everything can be defined eventually? These questions remain open-ended, making the Richard paradox an ongoing point of discussion in logic and philosophy. Grelling's paradox asks whether the word heterological, meaning not describing itself, describes itself. If it does, then it contradicts itself. If it does not, then it still contradicts itself. This paradox challenges the way we classify words and how language functions logically. A similar paradox appears in Russell's paradox, which deals with sets that either contain themselves or do not. If a set contains all sets that do not contain themselves, does it contain itself? If it does, it should not. If it does not, then it should. This same contradiction emerges in Grelling's paradox with words instead of sets. To break this down, consider how we classify words. Some words describe themselves. Short is short. English is an English word. Polysyllabic has more than one syllable. These are called autological words because they possess the property they describe. Other words do not describe themselves. Long is not a long word. French is not a French word. Monosyllabic has more than one syllable. These are heterological words because they do not have the properties they describe. Now, if heterological is heterological, then it does not describe itself. But that is exactly what it means. It describes words that do not describe themselves. If it does not describe itself, then it must be autological, meaning it does describe itself. This contradiction creates an endless loop. To see how strange this is, imagine labeling objects based on whether they describe themselves. A book titled Thick Books could be thick or thin. If it's thick, the title is accurate, making it autological. If it is thin, the title is inaccurate, making it heterological. Now apply this logic to the word heterological itself. The problem emerges because heterological must belong to one category or the other, yet neither fits without leading to a contradiction. This paradox does not just exist in words. It appears in logic, self-reference, and even computer programming. When a program is designed to check if another program will stop or run forever, it runs into a similar issue. If it finds that the program will stop, what happens when it checks itself? If it finds that the program will run forever, what if it forces itself to stop? This is related to the halting problem in computer science, where a program cannot always determine whether another program will end. In real life, paradoxes like this challenge how we think about self-reference. A person who says, "I always lie," creates the same contradiction. If the statement is true, then they are lying, which means the statement is false. If the statement is false, then they must tell the truth, which means they always lie. This circular reasoning traps itself. A more subtle example appears in labels. Imagine a museum with two rooms. One room has all paintings that are not self-portraits. The other room has only self-portraits. Now, where do you put a painting of the two rooms together? If it belongs in the self-portrait room, it is incorrect because it contains paintings that are not self-portraits. If it belongs in the other room, it must contain itself, making it a self-portrait. Like Grelling's paradox, the act of classification creates the contradiction. The paradox shows how language and logic can break down under self-reference. Words, categories, and even logical systems can loop in on themselves in ways that make simple definitions impossible. Even though we rely on language to communicate, paradoxes like this show its limits. Definitions assume clear separation between what something is and what it is not. But self-reference blurs that line. This has real consequences beyond word games. In artificial intelligence, machine learning models analyze words and meanings. If a model tries to classify words into describing themselves and not describing themselves, it runs into Grelling's paradox. The model must decide what to do when a word contradicts its own classification. This problem can make automated language processing struggle with self-referential statements. Legal systems also run into this issue. Laws define what is legal and illegal, but sometimes a law must apply to itself. If a law says all laws must be approved by Congress, does that include itself? If it does, then how was it approved? If it does not, then it violates its own rule. This kind of paradox can create legal loopholes and confusion. Even mathematics is not free from this problem. Gödel's incompleteness theorems show that in any mathematical system, there are statements that cannot be proven true or false within that system. These statements resemble Grelling's paradox because they refer to themselves in ways that break the system's logic. No matter how much mathematics advances, it will always contain statements that it cannot resolve. In daily life, this paradox influences how we think about definitions. A definition should be clear and precise, but self-reference can make even simple words unstable. When people debate words like art, truth, or justice, they often run into similar paradoxes. If art is anything created with intention, then defining intention becomes crucial. If truth is what corresponds to reality, then defining reality becomes the issue. Each definition leads to further definitions, sometimes looping back on itself. This problem appears in politics and ideology as well. If a movement claims to oppose all movements, does that include itself? If a group says it welcomes all opinions, does that include opinions that reject inclusivity? These contradictions arise because real-world concepts are not always neatly separable into categories. Grelling's paradox is not just about words. It reflects the challenges of classification and logic in everyday life. Philosophy also struggles with this issue. If knowledge is defined as justified true belief, then what counts as justification? If someone believes something for the wrong reasons but happens to be correct, is that still knowledge? This leads to the Gettier problem, another famous paradox in epistemology. Like Grelling's paradox, it shows that simple definitions can break when examined closely. Grelling's paradox forces a rethink of how language, classification, and logic function. It reveals the hidden assumptions in how we use words. It also connects to deeper problems in logic, computing, law, and philosophy. This paradox is not just a puzzle, it exposes the limits of human reasoning. Yablo's paradox presents a strange situation in logic. Imagine an infinite sequence of statements, where each statement says that the next one in the sequence is false. The first statement says the second is false. The second says the third is false. The third says the fourth is false, and so on. Each statement depends on the next, creating a never-ending chain. The issue is that there is no base truth to anchor the sequence. If any statement were true, then the next one would have to be false. But if that one is false, the next one should be true, which starts the problem all over again. This paradox avoids the self-reference seen in something like the liar paradox, where a statement directly contradicts itself. Instead, it stretches the contradiction across an infinite sequence, making it harder to resolve. To break it down further, consider how negation works in logic. If you say, the next statement is false, and the next statement says the same thing about the following one, there is no final answer. If you try to evaluate the truth of any statement in the sequence, you find that it depends on something that is never resolved. The problem is different from circular statements because it does not loop back to a single claim. Instead, it spreads the contradiction out indefinitely. There is no single self-referential moment, but the paradox still forms because the chain never ends. Think of a long line of people, each whispering to the person next to them, "The next person is lying." If you try to find one who tells the truth, you can't. If the first person tells the truth, the second must be lying. But if the second is lying, the third must be truthful. If the third is truthful, then the fourth must be lying, and this pattern never stabilizes. No person in the chain can be definitively labeled as truthful or dishonest, because their truthfulness always depends on the next in line. This paradox is distinct because it does not rely on a loop. Many paradoxes, like the liar paradox, involve statements that contradict themselves. A classic example is, "This statement is false. If it is true, then it must be false. If it is false, then it must be true." Yablo's paradox does not use this kind of direct self-reference. Instead, it creates an infinite structure where each statement shifts responsibility to the next. There is no final contradiction to point at, only an infinite regress of dependency. Another way to illustrate the problem is to imagine a row of dominoes, each leaning on the next but never falling. If one were to fall, it would push the next, but the fall never begins because there is no first domino to tip over. Each domino's state depends on the next one, and without an endpoint, the sequence never resolves into true or false. Logic relies on having base truths to determine the validity of statements, but Yablo's paradox removes any base, leaving an unending structure that cannot be verified. This paradox has implications in many areas of philosophy and mathematics. It challenges the way we think about truth in sequences. Normally, when analyzing a series of statements, we look for a fundamental truth that we can use to evaluate the rest. But here, there is no such truth to anchor the sequence. Some philosophers argue that Yablo's paradox demonstrates a flaw in how logic handles infinite sequences. Others suggest that the paradox shows the limitations of classical truth definitions. It raises the question of whether an infinite regress of statements can be treated differently than a self-referential paradox. To make the problem even clearer, imagine a book where every page says, "The statement on the next page is false." If you start at page 1 and try to determine whether the first statement is true or false, you realize that you have to check the next page. But the next page does not resolve anything. It only passes the problem further. No matter how many pages you read, you never find a final statement that breaks the cycle. The paradox lies in the fact that every statement seems logically sound on its own, but together they create a contradiction that cannot be resolved. This paradox also has an interesting connection to language and meaning. In normal conversation, when someone says that another statement is false, we expect to be able to verify that claim. But in this case, every verification attempt leads to another unverified claim. The meaning of each statement depends entirely on another statement that remains unresolved. This suggests that truth, in some cases, is not simply a matter of evaluating statements in isolation, but of considering the structure in which they exist. If every truth claim depends on an unresolved next step, truth itself becomes unstable. Some logicians have tried to find ways around Yablo's paradox by introducing alternative logical frameworks. Certain non-classical logics attempt to handle infinite sequences differently, suggesting that the paradox might not be as much of a contradiction as it seems. Others argue that it exposes an inherent problem in how we define truth. By constructing a paradox without direct self-reference, Yablo showed that contradictions in logic do not always need a circular structure. Sometimes, they can arise purely from infinite dependency. The paradox has also been compared to problems in computer science and artificial intelligence. When designing self-learning algorithms, one issue that arises is how knowledge is validated. If every piece of knowledge depends on another piece of knowledge that has not been validated, the system cannot establish a base truth. This mirrors the problem in Yablo's paradox, where each statement relies on an unresolved next step. Some researchers look at this paradox as an example of why certain types of infinite regress should be avoided in logical systems. There is also a connection to paradoxes in physics, particularly those dealing with infinity and measurement. Some theories in quantum mechanics suggest that certain states of reality cannot be directly observed without creating an infinite regression of dependencies. Yablo's paradox provides a linguistic and logical analogy for these kinds of issues. When analyzing infinite regress, whether in logic, language, or physics, the core problem remains the same. If every step relies on another unresolved step, then certainty becomes impossible. Despite its complexity, the paradox remains relatively unknown outside of philosophical and mathematical circles. Most people are familiar with self-referential paradoxes like the liar paradox, but Yablo's version avoids direct self-contradiction while still creating an unresolvable logical structure. This makes it a valuable tool for understanding how infinite sequences can generate problems in logic. The paradox also raises questions about how humans process information. People rely on chains of reasoning to make decisions, but if a reasoning chain were structured like Yablo's paradox, it would never reach a final conclusion. This suggests that practical reasoning depends on having at least some base truths that do not rely on an infinite regress. Without these, decision-making would become impossible. Overall, Yablo's paradox provides a unique challenge to traditional logic. By structuring an infinite sequence of statements in a way that creates a never-ending dependency, it highlights the limitations of classical truth evaluation. The paradox does not rely on self-reference, making it distinct from other logical contradictions. It shows that even without circular reasoning, a logical system can collapse under the weight of infinite regress. Skolem's paradox arises in set theory and logic. It challenges intuition about the size of mathematical objects. The paradox appears when a formal system that describes infinite sets has a model that itself seems to be only countable. This situation seems contradictory because it suggests that a structure containing uncountable sets can be described in a framework where everything is countable. The contradiction is not real in a strict logical sense, but it highlights deep questions about how mathematics models reality. To understand the paradox, consider the idea of countability. A set is countable if its elements can be listed in a sequence, like the natural numbers 1, 2, 3, and so on. A set is uncountable if no such sequence can cover all its elements. The classic example of an uncountable set is the real numbers between 0 and 1. Cantor's diagonal argument shows that no list can include every real number, proving the set is uncountable. Formal set theory, like Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory with the axiom of choice, ZFC, describes mathematical objects, including uncountable sets. The paradox arises from a result in mathematical logic called the Löwenheim-Skolem theorem. This theorem says that if a formal system has an infinite model, it also has a countable model. That means ZFC, which describes uncountable sets, has a model that is itself countable from the outside. This seems to suggest that uncountable sets exist inside something countable. The contradiction is only apparent. It comes from a difference in perspective. Inside the model, the usual definitions of countable and uncountable work as expected. If you ask whether the real numbers in this model are uncountable, the model will say yes. But from an outside perspective, the whole model can be matched with the natural numbers, making everything inside appear countable. This shift in perspective is unsettling because it suggests that uncountability depends on the framework from which you observe it. Imagine a librarian who believes their library contains an infinite collection of books, including entire shelves of uncountable volumes. They check the records and confirm that certain sections hold books that cannot be listed in order. But an outside observer has a master list that includes every book. The librarian insists the collection contains uncountable sections, but the observer sees a listable collection. The librarian's understanding is correct within the library, but the observer sees a broader picture that reveals an apparent contradiction. This paradox does not mean that uncountable sets do not exist. Instead, it reveals a limitation of formal systems. Mathematical descriptions of infinity depend on the framework in which they are considered. The existence of an uncountable set is a property defined within a system, not an absolute fact that holds in every possible perspective. The paradox also raises questions about mathematical reality. If a formal system can describe uncountable sets, but those sets exist within a countable model, does this mean uncountability is just a matter of language? Some interpretations of mathematics suggest that mathematical objects only exist in the systems that define them. In this view, uncountability is real within standard mathematics but meaningless outside it. Others argue that the paradox suggests deeper issues with how mathematics describes infinite objects. If uncountable sets can exist inside something countable, does this imply a flaw in set theory? Some believe that different models of mathematics can coexist, each with its own notion of infinity. A practical consequence of Skolem's paradox appears in computation. Computers work with finite structures, yet mathematicians use infinite objects to define numbers and functions. The paradox suggests that even when a system describes something uncountable, its actual representation might be countable. This idea influences areas like formal verification, where infinite structures must be approximated in finite ways. The paradox also connects to discussions about absolute mathematical truth. Some believe mathematics describes a unique reality, while others think it depends on the system used to describe it. Skolem's paradox suggests that mathematical truth might not be absolute, because different models can have different views of infinity. Although the paradox is technical, it has implications beyond set theory. It highlights how mathematical language shapes understanding. It shows that uncountability, a fundamental idea in modern mathematics, depends on context. It also suggests that no single system captures all of mathematical reality. Skolem's paradox remains a topic of discussion in philosophy and logic. It does not invalidate set theory, but raises questions about its interpretation. It reminds mathematicians that even well-established ideas can have surprising and unsettling properties when examined from different perspectives. Yields falsehood when preceded by its quotation, yields falsehood when preceded by its quotation. The sentence defines itself while also contradicting itself. It's an example of Quine's paradox, a self-referential statement that loops into contradiction without using direct self-reference. The structure of the paradox makes it hard to pin down exactly where the contradiction begins, making it unsettling. The essence of this paradox is self-reference in disguise. Consider a simpler version. This sentence is false. The contradiction is immediate because if the sentence is true, then it must be false, but if it's false, then it must be true. Quine's version takes a more indirect route. It instructs the reader to precede a statement with its own quotation, then asserts that the result is false. The statement, when followed, consumes itself in an endless cycle. Imagine a machine programmed to process sentences. If you feed it the phrase yields falsehood when preceded by its quotation, the machine follows instructions and forms a new sentence. Yields falsehood when preceded by its quotation, yields falsehood when preceded by its quotation. The machine must now evaluate whether this statement is true or false. If the statement is true, then it does yield falsehood, which means it must be false. If it is false, then it does not yield falsehood, meaning it must be true. The machine gets stuck in a logical deadlock. To see how this paradox works in a different setting, consider a group of friends discussing truthfulness. One of them writes a note that says, "The statement on the other side of this paper is true." They flip the paper over and find another note that says, "The statement on the other side of this paper is false." These statements send the reader into an infinite loop, just like Quine's paradox does with language. Self-referential paradoxes aren't just theoretical playthings. They challenge the foundation of logic itself. Formal systems rely on consistency, meaning that statements must be either true or false, not both. When a paradox like this one appears, it raises the possibility that language and logic contain unavoidable contradictions. A similar paradox occurs in programming. A function that calls itself indefinitely creates an infinite recursion, crashing a system if there's no condition to stop it. Quine's paradox mimics this behavior in human language. The phrase seems to have meaning, yet any attempt to evaluate its truth leads to a never-ending cycle. In legal language, a contradiction of this kind can create loopholes. Suppose a law says, "No law shall apply to this law." If the law applies to itself, then it contradicts its own rule. If it does not apply to itself, then it isn't valid in the first place. Loopholes in contracts or legal systems sometimes follow this pattern, creating ambiguities that courts struggle to resolve. Paradoxes of self-reference also appear in daily life. Imagine someone says, "I never tell the truth." If they're telling the truth about that statement, then they must be lying. But if they're lying, then they must tell the truth at least sometimes. Their statement cannot logically hold. The nature of self-referential paradoxes makes them particularly tricky in artificial intelligence. If an AI follows strict logic and encounters a paradox like this, it may not know how to proceed. Some AI systems handle contradictions by assigning probabilities rather than binary truth values. Others may detect paradoxical loops and reject them outright. But if an AI were truly bound to formal logic, encountering Quine's paradox would create an error with no resolution. The paradox also raises questions about meaning. If a sentence is structured properly but leads to logical contradiction, does it still have meaning? Some philosophers argue that paradoxical statements like this one are meaningless because they cannot be assigned a truth value. Others argue that the paradox has meaning because it conveys a contradiction, even if it cannot be resolved. In some ways, Quine's paradox exposes a flaw in how humans process language. People assume that if a sentence follows grammatical rules, it must have a definite truth value. But paradoxes like this show that language can be deceptive, following all the rules while making no logical sense. Imagine a debate in which one participant says, "Everything I say is a lie." If the audience accepts that statement as true, then everything else they say must be false, including the claim that they always lie. If the audience rejects the statement as false, then at least some of what they say must be true, contradicting their original claim. The paradox traps the conversation in an unsolvable loop. Computers face similar challenges when processing language. If a chatbot were programmed to analyze statements and respond logically, it would struggle with paradoxes like this. Some chatbots rely on probability to navigate confusing statements, treating them as ambiguous rather than strictly true or false. Others might recognize a paradox and issue an error message instead of engaging with it. Mathematics has its own version of self-referential paradoxes. Gödel's incompleteness theorems show that any sufficiently complex mathematical system will contain statements that are true but cannot be proven within the system. This means that paradoxes aren't just quirks of language, they're built into the structure of formal reasoning itself. Consider a slightly altered version of Quine's paradox. This statement is not provable. If the statement is provable, then it is false. But if it's true, then it cannot be proven, making it an example of a true statement that formal logic cannot validate. Gödel used this insight to show that mathematics is incomplete, meaning some truths will always lie beyond the reach of formal proof. Philosophy wrestles with similar paradoxes when discussing knowledge. The liar paradox, which states this sentence is false, raises the question of whether humans can ever fully grasp truth. If logic itself contains contradictions, can human reasoning ever be fully reliable? Some argue that paradoxes show the limits of logic rather than the limits of truth. Others suggest that truth itself is a flexible concept, changing depending on the context. Legal systems struggle with self-referential rules as well. Consider a law that states, "This law must be repealed." If the law remains in effect, it contradicts itself. If it is repealed, then it no longer exists to enforce its repeal. Laws often have to account for self-referential contradictions to avoid absurdities. Even literature explores paradoxes of this kind. Jorge Luis Borges wrote short stories filled with self-referential loops, such as a fictional encyclopedia that describes itself. In fiction, paradoxes create a sense of mystery and intrigue. In real life, they expose the boundaries of human understanding. Quine's paradox, at its core, challenges assumptions about truth and meaning. By disguising self-reference in an indirect way, it forces the reader into an endless loop. Language, logic, mathematics, and even law all struggle with similar contradictions. These paradoxes remind us that not everything can be resolved neatly and that even the most structured systems have cracks where contradiction seeps through. Bertrand's box paradox deals with probability and how our expectations often mislead us. Imagine 3 boxes. The first box contains 2 gold coins. The second contains 2 silver coins. The third contains 1 gold and 1 silver coin. You randomly pick a box, open it, and take out 1 coin. The coin is gold. What is the probability that the other coin in the same box is also gold? At first, the answer might seem obvious. There are 3 boxes, and only one of them contains 2 gold coins. That might lead you to believe the probability is 1 in 3, but that's incorrect. The key to solving this paradox is understanding conditional probability. First, consider the 3 possible boxes: gold, gold, silver, silver, and gold, silver. Since you have already picked a gold coin, the silver, silver box is no longer possible. That leaves only 2 remaining options: gold, gold, and gold, silver. You might think that means the chances are 50-50, but that's also wrong. To get a gold coin, you had to pick from either the gold, gold box or the gold, silver box. The gold, gold box contains 2 gold coins, while the gold, silver box contains only 1. That means you were twice as likely to have drawn from the gold, gold box because it had more gold coins to choose from. The correct probability that the other coin is also gold is actually 2/3. This counterintuitive result is an example of how probability can often mislead intuition. When people think about chance, they often assume each option is equally likely. But in reality, probability depends on the number of ways an event can occur. Since you were twice as likely to pick a gold coin from the gold, gold box than from the gold, silver box, the true probability of having another gold coin is higher than it first appears. A similar concept appears in other probability paradoxes, such as the Monty Hall problem. In that problem, a game show host presents 3 doors. Behind one door is a car, and behind the other 2 are goats. After you pick a door, the host, who knows what's behind each door, opens another door to reveal a goat. You then get the option to switch your choice. Many people assume the chances are 50-50 at this point. However, just like in Bertrand's box paradox, the correct answer comes from considering the ways events could have played out. If you stick with your original choice, you win only if you originally picked the car, a 1 in 3 chance. If you switch, you win if your original pick was a goat, which had a 2 in 3 chance. Switching, therefore, is the better strategy. These types of probability puzzles reveal how human intuition often struggles with conditional probability. People tend to view each event as independent, when in reality, past events influence future probabilities. Bertrand's box paradox challenges assumptions and forces a deeper understanding of how probability truly works. Imagine another scenario. You have a bag with 4 red balls and 6 blue balls. You reach in and randomly pull out a red ball. You then remove it from the bag without looking at the others. What are the chances that the next ball you pull is also red? At first, it might seem like you should ignore the first pick, treating the second pick as if the bag is still in its original state. But that's not how probability works. Because you removed a red ball, there are now fewer red balls left in the bag, so the probability of drawing another red ball is lower than before. Every action changes the conditions for the next event. This same misunderstanding of probability applies in gambling. Many gamblers believe in a hot streak, or that past outcomes can influence future ones in situations where each event is independent. A common example is the gambler's fallacy. If a roulette wheel lands on red 5 times in a row, many people believe black is due to come up next. But since each spin is independent, the probability of red or black remains the same on every spin. The wheel has no memory. Bertrand's box paradox also connects to real-world decision-making, particularly in medical testing. Suppose a disease affects 1 in 1,000 people, and a test for the disease is 99% accurate. If someone tests positive, many assume that means they have a 99% chance of actually having the disease. But this is incorrect because it ignores the base rate. If 1,000 people take the test, one of them actually has the disease and they test positive. But out of the 999 healthy people, about 10 will also test positive due to the 1% false positive rate. That means there are 11 positive tests, but only 1 real case of the disease. The true probability that a person who tested positive actually has the disease is only about 9%. This is called the base rate fallacy, and it shows up frequently in medical screenings, court cases, and even everyday assumptions. In financial markets, investors also fall into probability traps. Many people assume past performance predicts future results, but markets are full of randomness. A stock rising for 10 straight days does not guarantee it will rise on the 11th day. Yet people often assume trends must continue, just as gamblers believe in streaks. Probability and statistics guide professional traders, but even they sometimes make errors when emotions override logic. The importance of understanding probability extends to risk assessment. People are often more afraid of rare, dramatic events than they are of common risks. Shark attacks, for example, are far less common than car accidents, yet many people fear the ocean more than the highway. This is partly due to the availability heuristic. When an event is more vivid or memorable, people assume it is more likely than it actually is. If you were to construct a probability-based fear scale, rational thinking would place car accidents, heart disease, and infections at the top of the list, not plane crashes or lightning strikes. But humans don't think in pure probabilities. Emotion and perception distort our sense of risk. Bertrand's box paradox is simple on the surface, but it represents a deeper issue. People often misunderstand probability because their intuition is built for survival, not statistics. In everyday life, assuming equal likelihoods for unknown outcomes works well, but in structured problems, like the ones in probability theory, intuition fails. This paradox, like others in probability, forces people to reconsider how they think about chance and decision-making. Now, think about a final example. Suppose you are in a game where you must pick one of 3 doors. Behind one door is a prize, and behind the other 2 are nothing. You pick a door. The host, who knows what's behind each door, opens a different door to reveal nothing. You now have the option to switch your choice or stay with your original pick. Many people assume switching makes no difference, but just like Bertrand's box paradox, switching doubles your chances of winning. That's because your original choice had only a 1 in 3 chance of being correct, while the unchosen door that remains now holds the prize 2/3 of the time. Probability defies common sense in many cases. Whether it's Bertrand's box, the Monty Hall problem, or real-world decision-making, conditional probability leads to results that feel wrong, even when they are mathematically sound. The 2 envelopes paradox is a probability puzzle that seems simple but leads to a confusing loop of logic. The setup is straightforward. You have 2 envelopes in front of you. One envelope contains a certain amount of money, and the other contains either twice that amount or half of it. You don't know which is which. You pick an envelope at random and open it. Now you face a choice. Keep what you have or switch to the other envelope. Logic suggests switching is always the better option, but this reasoning creates an infinite loop that doesn't make sense. Imagine you open your chosen envelope and see $100. Based on the rules, the other envelope either has $50 or $200. You estimate your expected value by calculating probabilities. Since you don't know if your envelope is the smaller or larger one, you assume each possibility has a 50% chance. The expected value of switching is 0.5 times 50 plus 0.5 times 200, which equals $125. Since $125 is more than the $100 you currently hold, you should switch. But if the same reasoning applies no matter what amount you see, it suggests you should always switch, even before opening your envelope. This conclusion is absurd because it implies an infinite cycle of switching back and forth. The paradox arises because the logic ignores the initial setup. The amount in your envelope isn't chosen randomly after you open it. It was set beforehand. That means treating the 2 possibilities as equally likely isn't always valid. When you see $100, you assume it's equally probable that the other envelope has $50 or $200. But in reality, the process that determined the amounts might not have assigned equal chances to these possibilities. If the money was placed using a fixed rule, such as always doubling a base amount, then the probability distribution skews in ways that break the simple expected value calculation. This paradox challenges the way people think about probability and decision-making. It shows that applying naive probability reasoning without considering how the game is set up can lead to flawed conclusions. It also illustrates how expectations can be misleading when dealing with uncertainty. The infinite loop of switching suggests something is wrong with the reasoning, but pinpointing the exact issue is tricky. Different interpretations of probability provide different explanations, but no resolution fully satisfies every perspective. This makes the two envelopes paradox an enduring puzzle in probability theory and logic. The St. Petersburg Paradox describes a gambling scenario that seems to offer an infinite expected payout, yet no reasonable person would pay a large amount to play. This paradox exposes a problem in decision theory and probability, highlighting the difference between expected value and practical decision-making. Imagine a simple game where a fair coin is flipped repeatedly until it lands on tails. The number of times the coin lands on heads before that determines the payout. If the first flip is tails, the game ends immediately, and the player wins $1. If the first flip is heads and the second flip is tails, the payout doubles to $2. If the first two flips are heads and the third is tails, the payout doubles again to $4. This doubling continues indefinitely, meaning the possible winnings grow exponentially. The expected value of this game is calculated by summing the probability-weighted payouts for every possible outcome. The first outcome, tails on the first flip, has a probability of half and pays $1. The second outcome, heads then tails, has a probability of quarter and pays $2. The third outcome, heads then tails, has a probability of ek and pays $4. This pattern continues indefinitely. When these values are added together, the sum grows without limit, meaning the expected value of playing is infinite. Despite the infinite expected value, most people would hesitate to pay a large sum to enter the game. If a casino charged $1,000 per play, almost no rational gambler would accept. Even at $50 or $20, many would decline. This reluctance suggests a problem with the mathematical expectation, as the practical decision-making of real players does not align with the calculated value. One explanation involves diminishing marginal utility. The theoretical calculation assumes every dollar carries the same value to a player. In reality, people value additional dollars differently depending on their wealth. Winning an extra $1,000 might be life-changing for someone struggling financially, but would mean little to a billionaire. The expected value of an infinite payout does not account for the fact that real people experience money subjectively rather than mathematically. Another issue comes from the practical limits of the game. No casino or gambler has infinite money to fund an indefinite series of coin flips. In reality, the game would need an upper limit on payouts, which drastically reduces the expected value. If a casino caps the winnings at $1 million, the expected value calculation changes completely, making it much lower and more reasonable. Psychology also plays a role. Humans tend to evaluate risk based on intuition rather than pure probability. A person asked to wager $10,000 on a game where they could win infinite money might focus more on the immediate risk than the long-term gain. Since most real-world gambling games do not offer such exponential rewards, players hesitate to trust the logic behind this one. Another way to understand the paradox is to consider its real-world implications. Suppose someone offers to let you play for a $25 fee. The expected value suggests this is an incredible deal, yet most people would hesitate. Why? Because while the theoretical payout is infinite, the most common winnings would be very low. In the majority of games, the coin lands on tails within the first few flips, resulting in payouts of only a few dollars. Players instinctively recognize that most runs of the game will not come close to yielding massive payouts. This leads to an argument about probability distributions. While it is true that a few rare runs of the game could result in enormous winnings, the majority of plays would result in small payouts. The possibility of an infinite reward does not feel real when most players would only see small winnings. This disconnect between probability and lived experience discourages people from treating the game as a good bet. A related concept comes from behavioral economics. Humans often fear losses more than they value equivalent gains, a phenomenon called loss aversion. If someone pays $1,000 to play, losing that money outright feels far worse than any potential gain from the game. Even though the expected value is technically infinite, the immediate cost weighs more heavily in decision-making. To test the paradox, One could try playing a modified version of the game with real money. If a casino offered a version with a maximum payout of $10,000 and charged $50 per play, people might react differently. Some might play, but others would still hesitate, showing that the paradox persists even when adjusted for practical constraints. This paradox challenges traditional economic models that assume people act rationally based on expected value. The fact that real people behave differently suggests that utility, risk perception, and cognitive biases all play a role in decision-making. This observation is crucial for understanding why financial models based solely on expected value often fail to predict real-world behavior. In finance, a similar issue appears in stock market investments. A theoretically optimal investment might offer high expected returns, but carry so much risk that few people choose to invest. The logic of infinite expected value does not translate into practical decision-making, just as in the St. Petersburg game. One might argue that the paradox disappears when the game's assumptions are modified. If there were a guarantee that the game could be played indefinitely with infinite money available, then maybe someone would pay large amounts to play. However, this is purely hypothetical. No real-world system allows for infinite payouts, making the original paradox more of a thought experiment than a practical dilemma. The core issue remains: why does an infinite expected value fail to attract rational bets? The answer lies in the nature of human decision-making. While mathematical expectations suggest that infinite payouts make the game worthwhile, actual human behavior prioritizes different factors like probability, risk, and psychological biases. By examining the St. Petersburg Paradox, one sees the limits of traditional probability theory in explaining real-world decisions. While expected value serves as a useful tool in some cases, it does not always align with how people assess risks and rewards. The paradox highlights a deeper issue in decision-making. Pure logic often clashes with how humans actually think about money, risk, and opportunity. Arrow's Impossibility theorem states that no voting system can take individual preferences and create a fair societal ranking while meeting a set of reasonable criteria. This idea challenges the way people think about democracy and decision-making. Imagine a small town electing a mayor. There are 3 candidates: Alice, Bob, and Charlie. Each voter ranks these candidates in order of preference. Some prefer Alice over Bob and Bob over Charlie, while others prefer Charlie over Alice and Alice over Bob. The town wants a voting system that fairly converts these rankings into a final decision. It seems simple, but no system can satisfy all fairness conditions. Kenneth Arrow, an economist, identified 3 criteria that a fair voting system should meet. The first is unanimity. If every voter prefers one candidate over another, the final ranking should reflect that. The second is independence of irrelevant alternatives. Changing preferences for a losing candidate should not affect the ranking between the remaining candidates. The third is non-dictatorship. No single person should dictate the outcome regardless of others' preferences. Arrow proved that no system can meet all 3 of these conditions at the same time. Consider a runoff voting system. Voters rank candidates, and the lowest-ranked candidate is eliminated in each round until one remains. This system can fail the independence criterion. If a losing candidate drops out, the rankings may shift unexpectedly. A voter might prefer Alice over Bob when Charlie is in the race, but switch to preferring Bob if Charlie drops out. This means the final ranking does not only depend on the comparison between Alice and Bob, but also on an unrelated candidate. Another system is plurality voting. Each voter picks a single candidate, and the one with the most votes wins. This system ignores second-choice preferences. A candidate with strong second-place support may be more representative of the overall population than the one with the most first-place votes. For example, Alice could win 40% of the votes, while Bob and Charlie each get 30%. If nearly all Charlie's supporters prefer Bob over Alice, a majority actually prefers Bob. Yet, Alice wins under plurality rules. A ranked choice voting system allows voters to rank candidates. If no candidate has a majority, the lowest ranked candidate is eliminated and votes transfer to the next choice. This method sometimes leads to a situation where a candidate who would have won in a direct head-to-head comparison loses because of the way the votes transfer. This failure violates Arrow's criteria because the ranking changes due to the elimination process rather than pure voter preference. The Borda count method assigns points based on ranking positions. A first-place vote gets more points than a second-place vote, and so on. The candidate with the most points wins. This system meets unanimity but fails independence. If a losing candidate is removed, the points distribution shifts in unpredictable ways. The final ranking changes because of a candidate who was never going to win. Dictatorship avoids all inconsistencies by giving one person complete control. If a single voter decides the outcome, then all criteria are met, except fairness. This extreme case highlights the impossibility at the heart of Arrow's theorem. If fairness matters, some criteria must be sacrificed. Real-world elections illustrate these problems. The 2000 U.S. presidential election showed the effect of a third-party candidate. Ralph Nader's presence in Florida likely shifted votes away from Al Gore, giving George W. Bush the state and the presidency. If voters could have ranked candidates instead of choosing one, Gore might have won. But ranked systems create their own paradoxes. In a ranked choice system, a candidate's removal can change the final ranking in ways that defy direct voter preferences. Sports rankings face similar issues. College football teams are ranked based on multiple factors, including human polls and statistical models. If a lower-ranked team upsets a higher-ranked one, the rankings of unrelated teams can shift. This suggests rankings depend not just on performance, but on how the ranking system processes changes. Company hiring decisions encounter the same paradox. Imagine a company ranking job candidates based on experience, education, and interview performance. If a strong candidate withdraws, the relative rankings of the remaining candidates may shift unpredictably. This means hiring decisions depend on the presence of candidates who are no longer in contention. Legislative voting highlights another problem. Suppose a committee votes on budget allocations. Members rank funding priorities. The final decision should reflect the group's preference order. However, if one priority is removed from consideration, the rankings of the remaining priorities may change. This means the outcome depends on the alternatives available rather than just voter preferences. Arrow's theorem proves that no perfect voting system exists. Every system either allows unfair outcomes, ignores voter preferences, or lets irrelevant factors affect the results. This impossibility forces societies to choose which flaws they are willing to accept. Some systems prioritize simplicity. Plurality voting is easy to understand but ignores preference depth. Others focus on fairness but introduce complexity. Ranked choice voting considers preferences more fully but creates unpredictable results. Some systems attempt to balance fairness and practicality, but no method eliminates all problems. Elections are not the only decision-making process affected. Any ranking system, whether for awards, funding, hiring, or sports, faces the same paradox. This unavoidable flaw forces people to make choices knowing that no method is completely fair. You sit at a table with two identical envelopes in front of you. A host explains that one contains a certain amount of money and the other contains exactly twice that amount. You don't know which is which. You choose one envelope and hold it in your hands. The host then gives you a choice. You can either keep your chosen envelope or switch to the other one. You think for a moment. If you have the envelope with the smaller amount, switching doubles your money. If you have the envelope with the larger amount, switching halves it. But since you don't know what's inside, you reason through the probabilities. Imagine you play this game in real life. You pick an envelope, open it, and find $100. You now know the other envelope contains either $50 or $200. You go through the same probability calculation and get an expected value of $125 if you switch. You swap envelopes and open the new one. It has $200. Now you know the first envelope had $100. But if you apply the same logic again, you see an expected value of $250 from switching back. So you switch again, then again, falling into an infinite loop. This paradox has puzzled mathematicians and philosophers for years because it challenges basic intuition about probability and decision-making. The problem lies in the way expected values are calculated. The original reasoning assumes an equal chance of having the smaller or larger amount. But that's misleading because the dollar values don't follow a uniform distribution. If the game is repeated indefinitely with random amounts, the logic breaks down. There is no single correct probability distribution without more information on how the amounts were chosen. One way to resolve the paradox is to consider that the total money in the envelopes follows a predetermined rule. If the smaller amount is always chosen first, and the larger amount is always twice that, then switching isn't inherently better. The calculation that suggests an advantage fails to account for the process of selecting the money amounts. To see another flaw in the logic, think about the game with extremely large and small values. Suppose you open your envelope and find $1 billion. Do you still think there's a 50% chance the other envelope has 2 billion? That seems unlikely. More realistically, the game must have a limit on how high the amounts can go. Without knowing the upper bound, you're treating all amounts as equally probable, which isn't true. Now consider the paradox from a different perspective. Suppose before the game starts, the host randomly picks a number and puts it in one envelope. Then, they put either half or double that amount in the other envelope. This method avoids the logical contradictions because it defines a clear probability distribution. Now, when you open an envelope, you can use Bayes' theorem to adjust your belief about the likely contents of the other envelope. The switching dilemma disappears because the probabilities change based on the amount you see. There's another way to think about the paradox using a variation of the game. Imagine, instead of 2 envelopes, there are 100, each containing double the amount of the previous one. You pick an envelope at random, then get the option to switch with a neighboring one. This setup makes it clearer that the advantage of switching depends on where you start. If you happen to pick a middle envelope, switching up or down seems fair. But if you pick the highest or lowest envelope in the sequence, the choice is no longer balanced. Many variations of this problem exist, and the paradox remains an example of how probability can be counterintuitive. It also demonstrates that without knowing the range of possible values in the envelopes, the expected value calculation leads to absurd conclusions. The flaw isn't in switching itself, but in assuming that switching is always beneficial regardless of the chosen amount. Another way to resolve the paradox is to consider the game from the host's perspective. If the host decides the amounts after you pick an envelope, they control the possible outcomes. For example, if they always put $10 in one and $20 in the other, switching gives you an advantage only when you start with the smaller one. If they pick different starting values each time, then switching's benefit depends on their choice of distribution. The paradox disappears when the selection process is accounted for. Despite various resolutions, the 2 envelopes paradox remains a fascinating problem in probability theory. It shows how small logical errors can create endless loops in reasoning. It also highlights that probability alone isn't always enough to make decisions. Without knowing the process behind the game, the best choice isn't as obvious as the math suggests. While the paradox may seem like an abstract puzzle, it has real-world applications in economics, decision theory, and game theory. Many investment strategies resemble the 2-envelope problem. Investors often switch between assets based on expected value calculations, but without knowing the underlying distribution of returns, they might end up in a cycle of switching without gaining real value. Consider a stock trader who moves funds between 2 companies based on recent performance. If one stock doubled in value while the other halved, they might think switching is the best move. But if the underlying probabilities don't favor this strategy, they could end up with no long-term advantage. Just like in the 2-envelope problem, the assumption that switching is always beneficial can be misleading. Another example comes from gambling. Some casino games offer doubling bets, where you can switch your winnings for a chance to double them. The 2-envelope reasoning suggests that taking the bet should always be a good idea, but in reality, the odds are determined by the house. If you don't account for the full distribution of possible outcomes, you could end up stuck in a cycle of switching without actually increasing your winnings. A related paradox occurs in insurance. Suppose you buy a policy with a payout that can be doubled or halved under certain conditions. The expected value might suggest that switching policies to one with an uncertain payout is always better. But in practice, the way the payouts are structured changes the real probabilities. The two envelopes paradox is a reminder that probability calculations must consider the full range of possibilities. Just because a formula suggests switching is beneficial doesn't mean it's the right choice in all cases. Without understanding the underlying distribution of values, blindly following expected value calculations can lead to irrational decision-making. It's also a good example of how intuition and mathematics don't always align. The logical contradiction in the paradox comes from assuming a uniform probability where none exists. Once the range of possible values is considered, the paradox resolves itself. It's not that switching is always wrong, but that assuming switching is always right leads to infinite indecision. The paradox challenges the way people think about choices, uncertainty, and rationality. It's not just about envelopes and money, it's about how decisions are made under incomplete information. Even in everyday situations, people often face versions of this paradox. The key takeaway is that probability, while useful, isn't always straightforward. Olbers Paradox asks a simple question. If the universe is infinite and filled with stars, why is the night sky dark? At first, it seems logical that in an endless universe, every direction should lead to a star. If that were true, then the entire sky should glow as brightly as the surface of the sun. But when we look up at night, most of the sky remains black, with only a scattering of stars. This contradiction puzzled astronomers for centuries. Imagine standing in a dense forest where trees stretch endlessly in every direction. No matter where you look, your sight eventually meets the trunk of a tree. Now replace trees with stars. If the universe is infinitely old and filled with an infinite number of stars, then every line of sight should end at the surface of a star. Instead of darkness, the entire sky should shine with the intensity of the sun. Since this is not what we see, something must be wrong with the assumption. One possible explanation is that dust in space absorbs light, blocking the glow of distant stars. This idea sounds reasonable at first, but it creates another problem. If dust absorbs light, it must heat up over time. Eventually, it would reach a temperature where it emits as much light as it absorbs. Given enough time, the dust itself should glow just as brightly as the stars. This means interstellar dust cannot explain why the night sky is dark. Another possibility is that the universe is not infinitely old. If stars have only existed for a finite time, then their light has not had enough time to reach us from the farthest parts of the universe. Light travels at a fixed speed, about 186,000 miles per second. While that seems fast, it still takes time for light to cross vast distances. If the universe had a beginning, then light from the most distant stars simply has not arrived yet. This would create a horizon, beyond which the universe remains unseen. Edgar Allan Poe, the famous writer, was one of the first people to propose that the universe had a beginning as a solution to Olbers Paradox. In an essay from 1848, he suggested that if the universe was born in a sudden explosion, there would be a limit to how far light had traveled. This idea turned out to be correct. Modern science confirms that the universe has not existed forever. Instead, it began about 13.8 billion years ago in what we call the Big Bang. Since then, light has only had time to travel a limited distance. This means we cannot see stars beyond a certain point, and the night sky remains dark. There is another reason the sky is not filled with endless starlight. The universe is expanding. As space stretches, it causes light to lose energy. This process, known as redshift, shifts light from visible wavelengths to infrared or even microwave radiation. The most extreme example of this effect is the cosmic microwave background radiation. This faint glow fills the universe but is invisible to the human eye. It is the stretched-out remnants of light from the early universe. Because of redshift, many distant stars emit light that has become too weak for us to see. The combination of a finite universe age and cosmic expansion solves Olbers' Paradox. The stars that could have made the night sky bright are either too far away for their light to have reached us or have had their light stretched into invisible wavelengths. The dark sky is not proof that the universe is empty, but instead reveals its history and structure. If the universe were static and eternal, Olbers' Paradox would be a serious problem. But with our current understanding, the darkness of the night sky is not a mystery at all. It is a direct result of the universe's age, its expanding nature, and the limits of how far light can travel. The fact that we do not see a sky blazing with infinite starlight is one of the strongest clues that the cosmos had a beginning and continues to change over time. The question of why the night sky is dark may seem simple, but its answer touches on deep truths about the universe. It tells us that space is vast, but not infinite in what we can observe. It shows that light takes time to travel, meaning we see the universe not as it is, but as it was. Every star we observe is a glimpse into the past. Some of the stars visible in the night sky today may no longer exist, their light only now reaching us after traveling for thousands or millions of years. Astronomers continue to study the distribution of galaxies and the effects of cosmic expansion to refine our understanding of Olbers Paradox. Observations of deep space using telescopes like the Hubble and James Webb allow scientists to look farther back in time, seeing the earliest galaxies forming. These observations confirm that there was a time when stars did not exist, supporting the idea of a finite universe age. Some alternative theories attempt to explain the paradox in different ways. One idea suggests that perhaps the density of stars decreases at great distances, so the universe does not have a uniform distribution of light sources. However, current evidence supports a more even distribution of galaxies, making this explanation unlikely. Another hypothesis considers the role of black holes. If light from distant stars falls into black holes, it may never reach us. However, black holes make up only a tiny fraction of the universe's total mass, so they cannot be responsible for blocking most of the missing light. The night sky's darkness is not just a lack of light, but a story about the nature of space and time. It tells us that the universe is not eternal and unchanging, but dynamic and evolving. It reminds us that what we see in the sky is limited by the speed of light and the age of the cosmos. Every star, every galaxy, and every beam of light carries the history of billions of years. In everyday life, the darkness of the night sky is something most people take for granted. But behind it lies one of the most fundamental questions ever asked about the nature of the universe. The fact that this question had puzzled scientists for centuries shows how even the simplest observations can lead to profound discoveries. Loschmidt's paradox challenges one of the most fundamental ideas in physics, the relationship between time and entropy. The laws that govern how particles move work the same forward and backward in time. If you filmed a few gas molecules bouncing around inside a box and then played the video in reverse, it would look just as natural. But real life doesn't work this way. We see eggs break, not unbreak. We see coffee cool down, not warm itself back up. This is what entropy describes. It always increases, meaning disorder in a system grows over time. Loschmidt's paradox asks why this happens if the fundamental laws of physics allow motion to be perfectly reversible. Imagine a room filled with gas. The molecules bounce around, colliding with each other and the walls. Over time, they spread out evenly across the room. If you release gas from a small container, it will disperse into the air. You never see the opposite happen. You never see scattered gas suddenly rush back into its original container. But if you look at the molecular level, nothing in the equations governing those particles forbids it. The equations work just as well if you reverse time. This creates a deep contradiction. If time reversal is possible in theory, why don't we ever see it in practice? One answer involves probability. When gas molecules spread out, they move into a highly probable arrangement. There are countless ways for molecules to distribute themselves evenly in a room, but only a few ways for them to all cluster back into one place. If you shake a box of sand, the grains move into random positions. You won't see them suddenly sort themselves into a neat stack. The same principle applies to gas molecules. While it's not impossible for them to randomly move back into their original space, it's so unlikely that it never happens in any meaningful time frame. Entropy, in simple terms, measures disorder. The second law of thermodynamics states that entropy in a closed system tends to increase. This means that systems move from order to disorder naturally. A deck of shuffled playing cards won't spontaneously return turn to a perfectly ordered state. A hot cup of coffee placed in a room will lose heat, not gain it. These changes happen because they represent a move toward a more probable state, not because there's anything stopping the reverse from happening on a microscopic level. Loschmidt's paradox digs into the contradiction between microscopic reversibility and macroscopic irreversibility. If every small-scale interaction obeys time-reversible laws, then the entire system, made up of those interactions, should also be reversible. But our experience tells us otherwise. This raises a deeper question. Is entropy increase truly a law of nature, or is it just an illusion created by probability? One way to think about this problem is to imagine a movie of gas spreading throughout a room. If you watch the movie backward, the gas would appear to gather into one spot, which never happens in real life. Yet, if you only looked at the movement of each individual gas molecule, the forward and backward versions of the film would both obey the same physical laws. The paradox suggests that something is missing from our understanding. The laws of motion don't favor one direction of time over the other, but our experience clearly does. One approach to resolving the paradox involves initial conditions. If the universe started in a low entropy state, meaning it began in an ordered configuration, then entropy would naturally increase as time moves forward. If the early universe was extremely uniform and structured, disorder could only grow over time. This explanation doesn't fundamentally resolve the contradiction, but it explains why we observe entropy increasing. The laws of physics allow time to move forward or backward, but the conditions of the early universe set time on a forward path. Another way to approach the paradox is through information. When entropy increases, information about past states is lost. If you mix milk into coffee, you can't easily separate them again. The microscopic equations still allow for reversibility, but practically, that information is gone. In theory, if you tracked the motion of every molecule, you could reverse the process. But in real life, there is no way to do this. The larger the system, the harder it becomes to track every part, making reversibility impossible at a practical level. Loschmidt's paradox highlights a tension between physics at different scales. At the level of individual particles, movement follows predictable, time-reversible rules. But at the scale of real-world experience, things behave differently. The paradox suggests that there is a missing link between the laws of motion and the flow of time. It forces us to question whether entropy increase is a fundamental law or just an emergent property of large systems. One way to explore this is through a thought experiment. Imagine a set of billiard balls on a pool table. If you hit them, they scatter in different directions. If you recorded this and played it in reverse, it would still look realistic. Every interaction follows the laws of motion. But if you started with a random pile of balls and watched them spontaneously arrange themselves into a neat triangle, it would look unnatural. The same logic applies to entropy. In principle, a room full of scattered molecules could return to an ordered state, but the number of ways for disorder to grow far outweighs the number of ways for order to return. The paradox also connects to the concept of the arrow of time. In our daily lives, time only moves forward. We remember the past, but not the future. We see objects break, but not unbreak. If physics works the same in both directions, why does time seem to have a preferred direction? One idea is that entropy increase defines the arrow of time. If entropy always rises, then the forward direction of time is simply the direction in which disorder grows. But this explanation assumes entropy increase as a given rather than answering why it happens. Another complication comes from quantum mechanics. At the smallest scales, particles don't behave like solid objects. They exist in probabilistic states and only settle into definite states when observed. This raises questions about how entropy and reversibility work at the quantum level. Some interpretations suggest that measuring a system forces it into a state that increases entropy. If true, then observation itself could play a role in why entropy always rises. There are also connections between entropy and gravity. Some theories propose that gravity naturally leads to increasing entropy by causing matter to clump together over time. Galaxies, stars, and planets form due to gravitational attraction, which creates structure from chaos. This might seem to contradict entropy increase, but in a broader sense, it supports it. The formation of complex structures leads to more ways for disorder to grow in the long run. Loschmidt's paradox remains one of the most thought-provoking challenges in physics. It forces scientists to question whether entropy increase is truly a fundamental law or just a byproduct of the universe's conditions. The paradox reminds us that even well-established ideas, like the second law of thermodynamics, still contain deep and unresolved mysteries. The Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen (EPR) paradox challenges the foundations of quantum mechanics and relativity. It begins with a thought experiment designed to show that quantum mechanics is incomplete. Albert Einstein, Boris Podolsky, and Nathan Rosen published the idea in 1935, arguing that if quantum mechanics were correct, it would lead to an unsettling consequence. Information could travel faster than light. This would violate one of the core principles of Einstein's theory of relativity, which states that nothing can exceed the speed of light. Imagine a particle that splits into two smaller particles traveling in opposite directions. According to quantum mechanics, these particles are entangled, meaning their properties remain linked no matter how far apart they move. If someone measures the state of one particle, the state of the other instantly adjusts, as if it knows what happened to its twin. The problem is that this adjustment appears to happen immediately, without any time delay. Since the two particles could be light years apart, this effect seems to suggest faster than light communication, something Einstein considered impossible. To understand why this is troubling, consider a simpler analogy. Suppose you and a friend each receive a sealed envelope, and one contains a red card while the other contains a blue card. You don't know which is which, but you know that one envelope must contain red and the other must contain blue. If you open your envelope and see a red card, you immediately know your friend has the blue card, even if they are on the other side of the universe. This kind of instant knowledge is not strange because the colors were determined when the envelopes were sealed. The issue with quantum entanglement is that the properties of the particles do not exist in a definite state until they are measured. Unlike the envelopes, which contained a red or blue card from the start, the entangled particles seem to make their decisions at the moment of measurement. This means the second particle must learn the result of the first particle's measurement instantly, no matter how far apart they are. Einstein and his colleagues saw this as a problem. They believed that particles must have some hidden properties, often called hidden variables, that determine their behavior before measurement. If such hidden variables existed, quantum mechanics would not be a complete theory. Instead of particles communicating faster than light, these hidden properties would simply be carrying the necessary information from the start, just like the envelopes. But quantum mechanics, as formulated by Niels Bohr and others, insisted that no such hidden variables were necessary. The state of a particle was not decided until the moment of measurement. The paradox becomes even stranger when experiments confirm quantum mechanics rather than Einstein's expectations. In the 1960s, physicist John Bell formulated a mathematical inequality to test whether hidden variables could explain entanglement. His work showed that if local hidden variables existed, certain statistical patterns should appear in experimental results. But experiments repeatedly violated Bell's inequality, meaning that entanglement cannot be explained by local hidden variables. The results imply that either information travels faster than light, or reality does not behave the way we assume it should. Physicists now accept that entanglement is real and follows the rules of quantum mechanics, but they disagree on what it means. One view, known as non-locality, suggests that quantum mechanics allows for connections that do not rely on classical space and time. This means entangled particles are linked in a fundamental way that does not involve transmitting signals. Another interpretation argues that measuring one particle does not send information to the other, but simply updates the knowledge of an observer. In this view, the change happens in the mathematical description, not in physical space. Regardless of interpretation, entanglement has practical implications. It forms the basis of quantum computing, where entangled particles allow faster processing than classical systems. It also plays a role in quantum cryptography, providing secure communication methods that rely on the fundamental unpredictability of quantum states. Yet, despite these applications, the paradox remains unresolved in a fundamental sense. The contradiction between quantum mechanics and relativity continues to push physicists to explore deeper questions about the nature of reality. The EPR paradox forces a confrontation between two pillars of modern physics. Quantum mechanics successfully predicts the behavior of particles at small scales, while relativity describes the structure of space, time, and gravity. The two theories should fit together, but entanglement suggests a gap in our understanding. One possible resolution could come from a future theory of quantum gravity, which would unify these seemingly contradictory frameworks. Until then, the EPR paradox remains a reminder that the universe does not always follow common sense rules. Black holes create one of the biggest puzzles in physics. They form when a massive star collapses under its own gravity, creating a region where nothing can escape, not even light. The edge of this region is called the event horizon. Anything that crosses it is lost to the outside world. If you drop something into a black hole, you can never get it back. But the real problem begins when you ask what happens to the information about whatever fell in. In physics, information is fundamental. It describes the state of a system, whether it is a book, a rock, or a cloud of gas. The laws of quantum mechanics say that information cannot be destroyed. If you know the current state of a system, you should be able to work backward and determine how it got there. This principle is at the heart of quantum physics, and it holds true in every tested experiment. But black holes seem to break this rule. When an object falls into a black hole, all information about it appears to be lost. The only details that remain are the black hole's mass, charge, and spin. Physicists call this the no-hair theorem. It means that two black holes with the same mass, charge, and spin are identical, no matter what fell into them. Whether a black hole was formed from a pile of books or a cloud of gas, nothing about the original material seems to survive. The problem becomes worse when considering what happens over time. In 1974, Stephen Hawking showed that black holes are not completely black. They emit radiation due to quantum effects near the event horizon. This radiation, now called Hawking radiation, carries away energy. Over time, the black hole loses mass and eventually evaporates. This leads to a paradox. If a black hole disappears, where does the information about everything that fell in go? If the information is truly lost, it contradicts quantum mechanics, which says that information must always be preserved. But if information somehow escapes, it conflicts with relativity, which says that nothing can get out of a black hole once it crosses the event horizon. This contradiction is what makes the black hole information paradox so difficult. To understand why information loss is a problem, consider burning a book. The pages turn to ash and the ink evaporates, but in principle, the information in the book is not gone. If you had a powerful enough computer, you could analyze the smoke, heat, and ash to reconstruct what was written. This is because the laws of physics are reversible. But if you throw a book into a black hole, nothing seems to remain. If the black hole eventually evaporates, it leaves behind only thermal radiation, which carries no trace of the original book. This suggests true information loss, something that quantum mechanics does not allow. Physicists have proposed several ideas to resolve the paradox. One is that information is stored in the event horizon itself, in a form known as a hologram. This idea comes from the holographic principle, which suggests that all the information about a three-dimensional object can be stored on a two-dimensional surface. If this is true, then the information about objects falling into a black hole is not lost, but encoded on the event horizon. Another possibility is that information escapes in the Hawking radiation. Some physicists believe that subtle quantum correlations between the black hole and its radiation could preserve the information. This would mean that, although it appears random, Hawking radiation actually contains hidden information about what fell in. The problem with this idea is that it would require new physics beyond what is currently understood. Some researchers think that black holes may not completely evaporate. Instead, they might leave behind a small, stable remnant that stores all the information. These remnants would be extremely dense and could potentially solve the paradox, but they create new problems. If every black hole leaves behind a remnant, the universe would eventually be filled with these objects, leading to contradictions with current theories of gravity. There is also the idea that black holes do not truly trap information, but instead connect to other parts of the universe through hidden pathways. These pathways, sometimes called wormholes, could allow information to escape without violating relativity. While interesting, this idea is highly speculative and lacks experimental evidence. The paradox is so challenging that some physicists have suggested that quantum mechanics itself may need to change. This would be a radical shift, as quantum mechanics is one of the most successful theories in history. Yet, if black holes truly destroy information, something fundamental about our understanding of reality is missing. The search for a solution has led to deep connections between black holes, quantum information, and the nature of space and time. One promising approach involves quantum entanglement, where particles become linked in a way that one instantly affects the other, no matter how far apart they are. Some researchers believe that entanglement could be the key to understanding how information is preserved in black holes. Efforts to understand the paradox have led to the development of string theory, a theoretical framework that attempts to unify gravity and quantum mechanics. In some versions of string theory, black holes are not fundamental objects but instead emerge from deeper principles. These ideas have provided insights but no definitive answer. More recently, some researchers have proposed that black holes might have a firewall at the event horizon. This firewall would destroy anything that falls in, preventing information from being lost. However, this idea conflicts with Einstein's theory of relativity, which says that someone falling into a black hole should not experience anything unusual at the event horizon. The debate over firewalls remains unresolved. The paradox has real consequences beyond black holes. If information can be lost, then the basic rules of physics must change. This could affect everything from particle physics to the fundamental nature of the universe. Some physicists suspect that solving the paradox will require a completely new way of thinking about space, time, and gravity. The problem remains one of the biggest unsolved mysteries in physics. Theoretical advances continue to provide possible explanations, but none have been proven. New observations of black holes, such as those from the Event Horizon Telescope, may offer clues, but for now, the information paradox remains an open question. Time moves in one direction. You wake up, go through your day, and eventually go to sleep. No matter what you do, you can't go back and change what already happened. Yet, the fundamental laws of physics don't seem to care which way time flows. The equations that describe how particles behave work just as well, whether time moves forward or backward. If you were to watch a video of two billiard balls colliding and then watch it in reverse, it would still follow the laws of motion. But in daily life, time only moves in one direction. Ice melts, people age, and broken glass never jumps back together. This is the arrow of time paradox. The second law of thermodynamics plays a key role. It states that entropy or disorder always increases in a closed system. Imagine a deck of cards shuffled into a random order. It is easy to make them more disorganized, but almost impossible to get them back into perfect order by shuffling randomly. Entropy explains why time has a direction. If you drop an egg on the floor, it breaks into a messy pile of shell and yolk. The molecules that made up the egg could, in theory, move in reverse and reassemble themselves, but they don't. The natural tendency is for disorder to increase, not decrease. Temperature differences also show this effect. If you put a hot coffee cup in a cold room, it cools down. The heat spreads out into the air, but you never see the opposite happen. A cup of coffee never suddenly pulls heat from the air and becomes hotter on its own. The heat energy moves toward equilibrium, where everything is the same temperature. This process happens because there are more ways for energy to spread out than to gather together. It's not impossible for heat to randomly move back into the coffee, but the chances are so low that it never happens in practice. The arrow of time appears most obviously in human life. People remember the past but not the future. You recall what you ate for breakfast, but you have no memory of tomorrow's breakfast. This asymmetry shapes how we understand time. If the laws of physics don't enforce a direction, why do we only remember one way? Some scientists suggest that memory is just another result of entropy. The process of forming a memory requires changes in the brain, and those changes follow the same rule of increasing disorder. A memory is like a footprint in the sand. As time moves forward, the footprint remains, but the grains of sand never rearrange themselves to erase the step and leave a perfect beach again. Cosmology raises more difficult questions. The universe itself appears to follow the arrow of time. It started in a low entropy state with the Big Bang, and since then, disorder has increased. Galaxies form, stars burn out, and black holes consume matter. The universe expands, pushing everything farther apart. But if the laws of physics allow time to go both ways, why did the universe start in such an ordered state? This is one of the biggest mysteries in physics. Some theories suggest that time might run in the opposite direction in another part of the universe, but no evidence supports this yet. Quantum mechanics complicates the issue. At the smallest scales, particles don't behave like objects we see in daily life. They exist in uncertain states and can even appear to travel backward in time in some situations. Antimatter, for example, can be described as matter moving backward in time. Yet, when many particles interact, they follow the same rules as everything else. Entropy still increases, and time still moves forward. Another strange effect appears with black holes. When something falls into a black hole, it disappears forever. Information about that object seems lost, violating the idea that information must always be conserved. Some theories suggest that information is not truly lost but stored on the event horizon, the boundary of the black hole. This idea, called the holographic principle, hints that time and space may work in ways we don't yet fully understand. Some physicists explore whether time is just an illusion. Perhaps what we perceive as time passing is just a feature of how humans process information. If all moments exist at once in a block universe, then time is just our way of experiencing change. In this view, the past, present, and future all exist simultaneously, but we only experience them in one order. This idea doesn't change the reality of our experience, but it suggests that time's direction may be more about perception than physics. Experiments continue to test these ideas. Some researchers look for ways to reverse small-scale processes or find clues in particle behavior that might explain why time moves one way. Others explore whether time travel is possible within the laws of physics. So far, nothing has shown that large-scale time reversal could ever happen. But the mystery remains. If physics allows time to flow in both directions, why do we experience only one? A superintelligent being presents you with two boxes. One is transparent and contains a visible sum of $1,000. The other is opaque, and you don't know what's inside. The being gives you a choice. You can take both boxes or just the opaque one. The catch is that the being has already predicted what you will do. If it predicted that you will take both boxes, it left the opaque box empty. If it predicted that you will take only the opaque box, it placed $1,000 inside. The prediction has always been correct in past cases. Now you must decide. At first glance, it seems like a simple problem of expected value. If the being is always right, the best strategy is to take only the opaque box, because that guarantees $1,000. If you take both, you end up with just $1,000. But another argument suggests taking both boxes is always better. The money is already placed inside the opaque box before you make your choice. That means nothing you do in the present can change what's in the box. No matter what the being predicted, the contents of the box won't change after the fact. So by taking both boxes, you get either $1,000 or $1,000 and $1,000, and both of those options are better than just taking the opaque box. This creates a paradox. One line of reasoning says you should only take the opaque box. Another says you should take both. Neither argument seems wrong, yet they contradict each other. The paradox comes from the nature of prediction and causality. If the being is truly infallible, then your decision is already determined. If you choose to take only the opaque box, it must have predicted that choice and placed the money inside. But if you take both, it must have predicted that too and left the opaque box empty. This suggests that your decision was never really a decision at all. It was predetermined by whatever process the being uses to predict the future. This makes people uncomfortable. Free will feels like it's being taken away. The idea that a choice can be both yours and already known before you make it doesn't sit well with how we think about decisions. People like to believe that they can outthink a situation. But this paradox challenges that belief. If the being is never wrong, then there is no real decision-making involved. The money is there or it isn't, and your choice was always going to align with that. Some people try to break the paradox by questioning the reliability of the prediction. What if the being is almost perfect, but not completely? If it predicts correctly 99% of the time, should you still take only the opaque box? The argument for doing so remains strong, but some might think that in a rare case where the being is wrong, taking both boxes would be better. This version of the problem shifts the focus from logic to probability. If the being is nearly perfect, then the best bet is still to take only the opaque box. But if there's any real chance that it could be wrong, then the risk-reward balance changes. Another way to approach the problem is to ask whether prediction is the same as control. If the being knows in advance what you'll do, does that mean your decision was never truly yours? Some argue that this makes the paradox similar to debates about determinism. If everything is already set in motion, and if a perfect predictor could theoretically know all future outcomes, then choice itself is an illusion. But if choice is an illusion, then why does it feel so real? Why do you still experience the process of making a decision? The paradox also raises questions about causality. Normally, we think that causes lead to effects. You make a decision, and that decision determines the outcome. But in this case, the effect, whether or not the opaque box contains money, seems to come before the cause, which is your decision. The being's prediction was made in the past, yet it somehow reflects a decision that hasn't been made yet. It almost feels like time is working in reverse. This is why Newcomb's paradox is sometimes compared to time travel problems. In stories about time travel, paradoxes emerge when events seem to cause themselves. If someone travels to the past and gives Shakespeare a copy of his own plays, then who actually wrote them? If the being makes a prediction and that prediction determines your choice, then is it really a prediction, or is it part of the cause? Some people try to solve the paradox by suggesting that the being isn't actually predicting at all. Instead, it might be influencing. Maybe it understands human psychology so well that it knows how to present the problem in a way that makes you choose what it wants. Maybe it's reading tiny, unconscious signals in your behavior. In that case, it's not truly seeing the future. It's just manipulating you into fulfilling its expectations. But this explanation changes the paradox into something different. If the being is simply tricking you, then it's no longer a perfect predictor, and the paradox dissolves. Others take a more radical view and argue that the paradox isn't really a paradox at all. They claim that the contradiction exists only in how the problem is framed. If the being is always right, then there is no real choice, and treating it like a choice is the mistake. You are always going to take only the opaque box, or you are always going to take both. The illusion of choice is what makes the problem seem paradoxical. This paradox has fascinated philosophers, economists, and mathematicians because it challenges basic ideas about decision-making. Expected utility theory suggests that rational agents should always take both boxes. But real-world experiments suggest that many people instinctively take only the opaque box when presented with this kind of dilemma. This creates tension between different theories of rationality. Should rationality be based only on expected value, or should it account for the nature of prediction and causality? Some argue that Newcomb's paradox shows the limits of traditional decision theory. The paradox has also been used to explore ideas in artificial intelligence and game theory. If an AI could predict human behavior with extreme accuracy, should it act like the superintelligent being in the paradox? Some AI safety researchers worry that advanced prediction systems could create real-world versions of this dilemma. If an AI can forecast human actions before they happen, does that give it control over decision-making? Would people act differently if they knew their actions were being perfectly predicted? These questions have implications for ethics and the future of AI development. In philosophy, Newcomb's paradox is sometimes linked to discussions about free will and determinism. If the being's prediction is based on perfect knowledge of the world's state, then free will is an illusion. Your choice was determined long before you made it. But if free will exists, then there must be a way to break the prediction, which contradicts the assumption that the being is never wrong. This creates a deep philosophical tension that has no easy answer. Newcomb's paradox continues to puzzle and divide thinkers. It forces people to confront uncomfortable ideas about choice, prediction, and control. It reveals gaps in our understanding of rationality and decision-making. It challenges the way we think about the future and whether we can ever truly act freely. The problem remains open-ended, and different people interpret it in different ways, which is why it continues to be one of the most thought-provoking paradoxes in modern philosophy. A family sits in their living room on a hot summer day. The air conditioner hums quietly, and everyone seems comfortable. After a while, one person suggests driving to a restaurant in Abilene, a town an hour away. No one in the room particularly wants to go, but each person assumes the others do. They agree, pile into the car, and endure a long, hot, and unpleasant drive. When they finally arrive at the restaurant, the food is mediocre. On the way back, someone admits they never wanted to go in the first place. One by one, the others confess the same thing. They all made the trip despite no one actually wanting to. This is the Abilene Paradox, a situation where a group collectively makes a decision that none of its members truly support. The problem isn't conflict or disagreement. It's the opposite. People mistakenly believe they are going along with the wishes of the group, when in reality, no one wants the outcome. Instead of speaking up, individuals stay silent to avoid rocking the boat, leading to an unnecessary and unwanted decision. The paradox occurs in workplaces, families, social settings, and even government decisions. Imagine a team meeting where a manager proposes working on a weekend to meet a deadline. Most employees prefer not to, but they assume their colleagues agree with the idea. No one wants to seem lazy or uncommitted, so everyone nods along. The manager interprets their silence as enthusiasm, and the plan moves forward. Later, in private conversations, employees complain about losing their weekend, realizing they all felt the same way, but didn't speak up. In business, the paradox can lead to costly mistakes. A company might launch a product that no one on the leadership team actually believes in. Each executive assumes the others support it, so they avoid expressing doubts. After months of investment, the product fails, and only then do people admit they had concerns all along. The decision-making process broke down not because of disagreement, but because of false agreement. The same dynamic plays out in friendships. A group might decide to go to a specific movie, restaurant, or vacation spot, even though no one actually prefers it. Each person assumes the others are excited, so they don't voice their true opinions. Later, they realize everyone would have rather done something else. The Abilene Paradox is not the same as peer pressure or groupthink. In peer pressure, people conform because they fear social rejection. In groupthink, individuals stop thinking critically to maintain harmony. The Abilene Paradox is different because no one actually wants the outcome, yet they move toward it anyway. The issue is not dominance or persuasion. It is miscommunication and a failure to check assumptions. A real-world example can be seen in corporate scandals. A company might engage in risky behavior because employees assume their leaders endorse it. Leaders, in turn, assume employees support the direction. No one speaks up, so bad decisions gain momentum. When the consequences arrive, everyone wonders why no one objected earlier. Avoiding the Abilene Paradox requires a few simple but deliberate actions. First, groups need to create an environment where dissent is encouraged. A leader should explicitly ask, does anyone actually want to do this? Or is there anyone who has doubts? If people feel safe expressing their true opinions, unnecessary decisions can be avoided. Second, individuals must recognize their own role in the paradox. When someone assumes others support an idea, it helps to ask directly rather than guess. A simple question like, do we really want to do this, or are we just going along with it, can prevent wasted effort and frustration. Third, leaders should watch for signs of silent agreement. If a decision gets unanimous approval too quickly, it might indicate that people are holding back their true thoughts. Encouraging discussion and giving people time to express concerns can lead to better decision-making. In personal relationships, the solution is similar. Friends and family members should feel comfortable voicing preferences without fear of judgment. If a group is deciding on a plan, Checking for genuine enthusiasm rather than assumed agreement can prevent unnecessary trips to Abilene. In high-stakes situations, such as government or military decisions, avoiding the Abilene Paradox is even more critical. Leaders must ensure that those involved in decision-making feel empowered to speak up. If officials assume others support a policy when they actually don't, resources can be wasted and poor outcomes can follow. The Abilene Paradox is a reminder that silence does not always mean agreement. It highlights the need for open communication and the importance of questioning assumptions. When people assume others want something they don't, the result can be wasted time, money, and effort. The paradox thrives in environments where people fear disrupting harmony, but breaking the cycle is as simple as asking, do we really want to do this? A donkey stands between two identical piles of hay. Each pile is the same size, the same distance away, and equally appealing. The donkey, unable to find a reason to choose one over the other, never moves. It remains in place, hungry, until it starves. This situation describes Buridan's ass, a paradox in decision-making and free will. It challenges the idea that rational beings always make choices based on logic. The donkey follows pure reason, and because no logical reason exists to prefer one pile of hay, it fails to act at all. Imagine a person facing a similar dilemma, though with a decision that feels more human. Two job offers arrive at the same time. Both positions pay the same, have identical benefits, and seem equally appealing. The person, unable to justify choosing one over the other, delays the decision. As deadlines pass, both offers are withdrawn. What should have been a moment of opportunity turns into a loss. This is Buridan's ass in action. The paradox highlights the limits of pure rationality. In theory, logic should guide decision-making, but when all options appear equal, logical reasoning alone fails to provide an answer. In practice, humans rarely find themselves paralyzed in the way the donkey does. But hesitation in the face of seemingly equal choices is common. A shopper faces two brands of cereal, each priced the same, and with nearly identical ingredients. They spend several minutes comparing, reading labels, and looking for any minor difference that could justify a choice. A student with two study topics equally important for an exam struggles to pick one, losing valuable time in the process. These examples mirror the paradox on a smaller scale. The stakes aren't life or death, but the inability to act due to a lack of distinguishing factors is the same. The paradox assumes that a truly rational agent can only act when it sees a reason to prefer one option over another. But real-life decisions often involve factors beyond strict logic. Randomness, emotions, and even external pressure influence choices. A person choosing between two similar job offers might eventually flip a coin, listen to their gut, or let a deadline force their hand. A hungry donkey, unlike a human, lacks these additional decision-making tools. Buridan's ass also raises questions about free will. If decision-making follows a strict logical process, then in situations where logic provides no answer, action becomes impossible. But if people act without clear reason, does that mean choices are sometimes random? A person who flips a coin to choose between two jobs accepts an outcome that isn't driven by reason, but by chance. If choice relies on chance, then how much of it is truly a choice? The paradox applies to artificial intelligence as well. If an AI operates purely on logic, how does it decide between two perfectly equal options? Suppose a self-driving car must choose between two identical routes with no difference in travel time, safety, or efficiency. If it follows strict reasoning, it might remain stalled indefinitely, waiting for a logical basis to move forward. In practice, programmers introduce methods to prevent this. Some AI systems use built-in randomness or assign arbitrary priority values to ensure they don't freeze when faced with equal choices. In economics, the paradox appears in consumer behavior. When two products seem identical in price and quality, a consumer might delay a purchase. Marketing strategies counteract this by introducing artificial differences. A toothpaste brand might highlight an ingredient, even if both brands use it. One store might offer a limited-time discount, forcing urgency. These tactics create an imbalance where none existed, nudging the consumer to act. The paradox also ties into psychology, particularly in decision paralysis. When people are overwhelmed by choices, they often struggle to decide at all. A diner at a restaurant with 2 meal options may pick one easily, but a menu with 20 similar choices leads to hesitation and stress. This hesitation resembles the donkey's plight. The brain searches for a reason to prefer one option over another, and if the differences seem too small, it struggles. In philosophy, Buridan's ask questions whether purely rational beings can truly function in the real world. The paradox assumes the donkey has no internal impulses, instincts, or subconscious biases that would break the deadlock. But in reality, living beings rarely behave this way. Even if the hay piles are identical, a real donkey might still choose based on the direction of the wind, a sudden twitch of its muscles, or a random step forward. The donkey in the paradox is a hypothetical construct, not a real animal. However, humans do sometimes experience something close to the paradox when it comes to major life choices. A person might hesitate to break off a relationship, feeling that the choice between staying or leaving is equally weighted. Someone might put off a career shift for years, unable to decide whether the risks outweigh the benefits. When decisions feel equally good or bad, hesitation sets in. The longer the delay, the more likely external factors, like missed deadlines, lost opportunities, or unforeseen circumstances, will make the choice for them. Procrastination also shares similarities with Buridan's ass. A person faced with multiple important tasks, all equally urgent, might end up doing none of them. Instead of prioritizing, they become stuck, unable to decide which task to begin. The overwhelming sense of needing to make the right choice leads to inaction. The paradox suggests that strict rationality, when applied in an extreme way, can become self-defeating. Real-world decision-making often requires factors beyond pure logic. People rely on intuition, random impulses, deadlines, and social pressures to break indecision. If every decision required strict logical justification, even minor choices like selecting breakfast or deciding what clothes to wear would become impossible. Buridan's ass serves as a reminder that waiting for the perfect justification can sometimes lead to worse outcomes than making a choice and moving forward. The donkey starves not because food is unavailable, but because it cannot justify choosing one pile over another. In life, waiting too long to act on a decision can lead to missed chances, opportunities that disappear, and situations that resolve themselves in unintended ways. Even when two options seem equally good or bad, action is often better than endless hesitation. Making a choice, even if it isn't the absolute best one, allows progress. Otherwise, like the donkey, one risks standing still while the world moves forward. The Ellsberg Paradox challenges the way people make decisions when faced with uncertainty. It shows that individuals often prefer a known probability over an unknown one, even when probability theory suggests they should not. This preference contradicts expected utility theory, which assumes people make choices based on logical calculations of risk and reward. Imagine two urns filled with red and black balls. The first urn contains 50 red balls and 50 black balls. The second urn contains 100 balls, but the mix of red and black is unknown. You must choose one urn and bet on drawing a red ball. Most people pick the first urn because they know the exact odds, 50%. The second urn could have any combination of red and black balls, but logically, it should have the same expected probability. The lack of certainty, however, makes it less appealing. This preference for known risks over unknown ones, even when the odds may be the same, is what defines the paradox. Now consider a second decision using the same two urns. This time, you must bet on drawing a black ball. Again, most people pick the first urn. The probability of drawing a black ball is 50% in the first urn. In the second urn, since the ratio of colors is unknown, it could be better or worse than 50%. But if you consistently avoid the second urn for both bets, you are implying that the probability of drawing either color is lower than 50%, which is impossible. This inconsistency reveals the paradox. You distrust the unknown probability even when logic says you should not. This paradox challenges classical decision theory, which assumes people assign probabilities rationally based on available information. In reality, uncertainty influences choices in ways that defy logic. This effect appears in finance, insurance, and everyday risk assessments. When investing, people prefer stocks with predictable returns over those with uncertain but potentially better returns. In health decisions, they trust treatments with clear success rates over new ones with uncertain data, even if the unknown option has a reasonable chance of being superior. To understand why people behave this way, consider ambiguity aversion. The Ellsberg Paradox suggests that people dislike uncertainty itself, not just risk. Risk involves known probabilities, while ambiguity means not knowing the probabilities at all. The human brain struggles with ambiguity, often interpreting it as a greater threat than it might be. This is why people pay more for insurance against unlikely but well-defined risks rather than vague, undefined threats that may be more probable. The paradox also raises questions about decision-making models. Traditional economics assumes rational agents who maximize expected utility. Yet real-world choices show that psychological factors override pure probability calculations. Behavioral economics explains this by incorporating concepts like loss aversion, where the fear of losing something outweighs the potential gain of an equal or greater reward. This means that people avoid ambiguous choices because they fear the worst possible outcome, even if it is not the most likely. Consider a simple example in business. A company must choose between two suppliers. One has a well-documented performance record with a known 90% success rate. The other is a new supplier with an unknown track record. Rational analysis suggests that if the unknown supplier has even a 91% success rate, they would be the better choice. Yet most businesses stick with the known supplier, fearing the unknown risk, even though it could be lower than assumed. This same behavior affects public policy. Governments hesitate to adopt new policies with uncertain results, even when current policies are known to be ineffective. The uncertainty of change makes sticking with familiar but flawed methods seem safer. The Ellsberg Paradox explains why organizations resist change, even when logic suggests they should embrace it. The paradox also influences how people respond to medical treatments. If a new drug has uncertain success rates, patients and doctors often prefer older treatments with well-established but moderate success rates. Even if statistical models suggest the new drug is likely to be better, the lack of certainty creates hesitation. This slows the adoption of medical advancements, even when they offer clear potential benefits. Even in personal decisions, the paradox appears. Imagine choosing between two job offers. One company is well known, offering a stable salary with well-defined career progression. The other is a startup with high potential but uncertain growth. The safe choice is tempting because its risks are clear, while the unknown risks of the startup make it harder to evaluate. Many people take the predictable option, even if the startup's potential rewards outweigh the risks. This bias toward the known affects legal decisions as well. Jurors and judges prefer clear evidence over ambiguous testimony, even when ambiguity does not imply inaccuracy. If two witnesses give accounts of an event, but one is confident and the other uncertain, the confident testimony often carries more weight, even though both accounts may be equally valid. The Ellsberg Paradox also impacts financial markets. Investors prefer bonds with fixed interest rates over stocks with variable returns, even when the stock market historically provides better long-term growth. The preference for predictable outcomes leads to conservative investment strategies that may not maximize returns. Understanding this paradox helps explain why people make choices that seem irrational from a mathematical standpoint. It shows that decision-making is not just about numbers, but also about psychological comfort with uncertainty. Recognizing this bias can help individuals and organizations make better decisions by questioning whether their fear of the unknown is justified. Simpson's paradox happens when a trend appears in separate groups, but reverses or disappears when the groups combine. This goes against intuition and can lead to misleading conclusions. It appears in statistics, social sciences, and even medical studies, making it important to understand. Imagine two hospitals evaluating their surgery success rates. Hospital A has a 90% success rate for simple surgeries and a 60% success rate for complex surgeries. Hospital B has an 85% success rate for simple surgeries and a 55% success rate for complex surgeries. In both categories, Hospital A has better results, but when looking at the overall data, Hospital B appears to have a higher success rate. The explanation lies in how many of each type of surgery each hospital performs. If Hospital A performs more complex surgeries than Hospital B, its overall success rate might drop below Hospital B's, even though it outperforms in both categories. This is how Simpson's paradox creates confusion. A similar effect happens in hiring decisions. A company might have a higher acceptance rate for male and female applicants when analyzed separately. However, when the data combines, it may show a lower acceptance rate for one gender. This can occur when one department has higher overall acceptance rates but also receives fewer applications from a particular group. The numbers make it seem like discrimination is happening when, in reality, the grouping affects the outcome. This paradox has influenced real-world policies. Universities, for example, have faced lawsuits when aggregate acceptance rates seemed unfair, even when breakdowns by department showed no bias. The same issue has appeared in workplace pay gaps. If one group works in lower-paying fields at a higher rate, their overall average salary appears lower, even if they earn equal pay within their field. Without careful analysis, people might see a problem that doesn't exist or miss a real issue hiding in the numbers. Medical research provides another example. Suppose a new drug helps patients with a particular disease. A study breaks patients into two groups, those under 50 and those over 50. The drug improves survival rates in both groups. However, when all ages combine, the data might show worse survival rates. This could happen if the study includes more older patients who have a higher risk of dying regardless of treatment. The numbers suggest the drug is ineffective, even though it benefits every age group. A poor interpretation of Simpson's paradox could prevent useful treatments from reaching patients. Sports statistics also show this effect. A baseball player might have a higher batting average against both left-handed and right-handed pitchers in two separate seasons, but a lower overall average across the 2 years. This happens when the number of at-bats against each type of pitcher changes between seasons. The percentages appear contradictory because of how the data groups. Understanding Simpson's paradox matters because it affects decision-making. In public health, policymakers might compare survival rates of hospitals or treatments. If they do not account for group differences, they may fund the wrong programs. Businesses making hiring or salary decisions might think discrimination is happening when the data tells a different story. Even in criminal justice, arrest or conviction rates can seem to show bias when analyzed in the wrong way. The paradox appears in election results as well. A candidate could win the majority of votes in every district, but lose the overall election if the population distribution is uneven. This happened in the 2000 US presidential election, where Al Gore won the popular vote, but lost in the Electoral College. Grouping data differently can change how trends appear. The key lesson of Simpson's paradox is that data alone does not tell the full story. Looking at percentages or averages without considering how groups divide can lead to the wrong conclusions. The way data splits matters as much as the numbers themselves. Without proper analysis, people can see patterns that do not exist or fail to recognize real trends. Two people get arrested for a crime. The police have enough evidence to convict them on a minor charge, but need a confession to prove the serious crime. The prisoners are separated and given a choice. If one confesses while the other stays silent, the confessor walks free while the silent prisoner gets a harsh sentence. If both confess, they both get a moderate sentence. If neither confesses, they both get a light sentence. Each prisoner must decide without knowing what the other will do. This setup creates a problem. Each prisoner reasons that if the other stays silent, confessing will set them free. If the other confesses, confessing avoids the worst outcome. Rational self-interest pushes both toward confession, even though they would be better off cooperating and staying silent. They end up with a moderate sentence instead of the lighter one they could have had. This paradox challenges the idea that rational decision-making always leads to the best outcome. In real life, similar situations happen in business, politics, and everyday life. Companies that compete aggressively may lower prices to undercut rivals, but if both do it, profits shrink for everyone. Countries in an arms race might build more weapons to stay ahead, even though both would be safer by limiting their arsenals. Athletes in a competition may use performance-enhancing drugs because they fear others will, even though the sport would be better without them. The dilemma applies to smaller decisions as well. Two roommates might both prefer a clean apartment, but each might avoid doing the dishes, assuming the other will. As a result, the sink stays full. Friends in a group project might hope someone else takes the lead, and no one does, leading to a last-minute scramble. A key feature of the dilemma is the lack of trust. If the prisoners could communicate and make an enforceable deal, they would agree to stay silent. But since each fears betrayal, they make choices that harm them both. This explains why companies sign contracts, countries negotiate treaties, and societies create laws. These mechanisms help enforce cooperation, reducing the temptation to act selfishly. Game theorists have studied variations of this problem. In a one-time situation, defection, choosing self-interest is the dominant strategy. But in repeated interactions, different strategies emerge. If two people expect to interact often, cooperation becomes more attractive. A strategy called tit-for-tat has proven effective in simulations. It starts with cooperation but punishes defection by responding in kind. If the opponent cooperates again, it forgives and cooperates. This balance of punishment and reward encourages long-term cooperation. Real-world applications of the dilemma appear in economics and environmental policy. Companies deciding whether to pollute face a similar choice. If one company reduces emissions while the other doesn't, the polluter gains a competitive advantage. If both pollute, the environment suffers. If both cut emissions, costs may rise, but long-term sustainability improves. Governments often step in with regulations to enforce cooperation because relying on voluntary action leads to worse results. Public health provides another example. During a pandemic, individuals who follow safety guidelines protect themselves and others. If everyone follows them, the spread of disease slows. But each person might feel tempted to ignore precautions, trusting that others will follow the rules. If too many people think this way, the system breaks down and everyone suffers. The dilemma also affects political decisions. Nations considering disarmament or climate agreements face the same structure. Each country would benefit if all reduced weapons or emissions, but each also gains an advantage by letting others act first. The result is often gridlock, where no one moves forward because of fear of being exploited. Even in personal relationships, similar dynamics play out. Two friends might want to resolve a conflict but wait for the other to apologize first. A couple might hesitate to express vulnerability, fearing rejection. Each person's reluctance makes the situation worse, even though both want a better outcome. In workplaces, employees may hesitate to share knowledge with colleagues, fearing it gives others an edge. If everyone hoards information, the whole team suffers. If everyone shares, collaboration improves, but each individual worries about being the only one giving while others take. Technology companies dealing with data privacy face another form of the dilemma. If one company protects user data while another exploits it, the ethical company may lose customers or profits. If all companies exploit data, public trust erodes, but the incentive to act first remains strong. Regulation often steps in to level the playing field and enforce cooperation. The dilemma highlights why self-interest doesn't always align with the common good. In competitive environments, cooperation often requires mechanisms beyond individual choice. Contracts, regulations, reputations, and repeated interactions all help shift incentives toward mutual benefit. While the classic prisoner's dilemma assumes no communication, real-world situations often allow signals, agreements, or third-party enforcement. But when trust breaks down or enforcement fails, the dilemma resurfaces. Understanding it helps explain conflicts in business, politics, and everyday interactions, revealing why rational choices can lead to irrational outcomes. The paradox of voting starts with a simple idea. A single vote in a large election almost never decides the outcome. The chance that one ballot will change the result is so small that it rounds to zero. Yet millions of people take the time to vote in every election. This behavior seems irrational from a cost-benefit perspective. The cost of voting, which includes time, effort, and sometimes money, exceeds the direct benefit a voter receives. If the purpose of voting is to influence the result, then it appears pointless because one vote rarely matters. But if voting is irrational, why do so many people do it? Imagine an election with millions of voters. A person walks to the polling station, waits in line, and casts a ballot. They return home knowing that their vote will likely not change anything. If they had stayed home, the result would have been the same. If the only goal was to influence the outcome, they wasted their time. Yet this person still voted, just like millions of others who made the same seemingly irrational choice. A rational person makes decisions based on the expected benefit. The probability of an individual vote determining an election is tiny. For example, in a US presidential election, the odds that one vote will decide the outcome are less than 1 in 100 million. Even in a close race, the probability is small. If a person only votes to influence the result, then they should conclude that voting is not worth the time. If everyone thought this way, no one would vote. But since elections always have high turnout, something else must be at play. One explanation comes from the idea of civic duty. People vote because they believe it is their responsibility, not because they expect to change the result. This reasoning shifts the motivation from an individual benefit to a broader sense of participation. The act of voting itself becomes the reward. A person votes because they feel a moral or social obligation, the same way they might recycle or follow the law even when no one is watching. The paradox exists because this sense of duty leads millions of people to act against a strict cost-benefit analysis. Social pressure also plays a role. Many people vote because they do not want to be seen as someone who does not. Political campaigns and public figures push the idea that voting is a fundamental part of democracy. Friends and family often ask if someone voted, and there can be embarrassment in admitting that they did not. Studies show that people are more likely to vote when they know others will ask them about it. In some cases, governments even send letters reminding people that their voting history is public, which increases turnout. The paradox remains because these social influences make people vote, even when their individual impact is nearly zero. Another explanation is the idea of expressive voting. People vote to express their beliefs rather than to change the outcome. In this view, voting is like cheering for a sports team. A person does not expect their cheers to change the score, but they do it anyway because it feels meaningful. Casting a vote is a way of showing support for a candidate or a cause. It signals identity, values, and personal beliefs. People often discuss their votes with others, reinforcing the idea that voting has value beyond the election result. Consider a scenario where a person supports a third-party candidate who has no chance of winning. From a strategic perspective, voting for this candidate is a waste. The person could instead vote for a more viable candidate who aligns with some of their views. But many still vote for third-party candidates because they see the act as a statement. They do not expect to win, but want to show their position. This is another way in which voting appears irrational under a simple cost-benefit analysis, but makes sense when considering personal expression. Psychology also helps explain the paradox. People overestimate the importance of their own actions. This is known as the illusion of control. Even in a large election, some voters believe their ballot has a meaningful effect. This belief is reinforced when elections are close. If an election comes down to a small number of votes, it gives the impression that every vote matters, even though the probability of an individual vote deciding an election remains low. The paradox of voting also challenges economic theories. Traditional economics assumes that people act rationally to maximize their self-interest. If this were always true, voter turnout would be much lower. But in reality, people do things that do not offer a direct payoff. They donate to charity, help strangers, and vote in elections even when their vote is unlikely to make a difference. These actions suggest that human behavior cannot be explained by self-interest alone. Another factor is habit. Many people vote simply because they have always done so. Once a person starts voting, they are likely to continue. Election participation is higher among those who voted in the past. This habit-forming behavior suggests that the initial decision to vote might be influenced by external factors like family traditions, school programs, or early socialization. Over time, voting becomes part of a person's routine. The paradox still holds because the original reason for voting fades, yet the action continues. The voting paradox also applies at different levels of government. A presidential election attracts the most attention, but local elections often have lower turnout. The irony is that a vote in a small local election is much more likely to change the result than a vote in a national election. Yet, people are more likely to skip local elections despite having a higher chance of making an impact. This behavior further complicates the paradox. If people vote because they believe in their individual influence, they should prioritize local elections. But most do the opposite, voting in high-profile races while ignoring the elections where their vote matters more. Some argue that the paradox is not a paradox at all. They say voting is a form of collective action. If everyone thought their vote did not matter, then no one would vote, and democracy would collapse. This argument assumes that people recognize their role in a larger system and act accordingly. But the problem is that each individual still faces the same choice. They can personally skip voting while relying on others to participate. If enough people make this decision, turnout drops and the system weakens. Imagine a scenario where a storm is approaching a city. The mayor orders an evacuation, but each resident knows that their individual car will not affect the overall traffic. If a person stays behind, the roads will still be congested with others evacuating. But if everyone thought this way, no one would leave, and the consequences would be disastrous. Voting works the same way. A single ballot does not decide an election, but if enough people decide not to vote, it changes the outcome. The paradox also extends to issues of voter suppression and access. Some people argue that certain laws make voting harder, discouraging participation. If the act of voting already comes with a cost, then increasing that cost should reduce turnout. But history shows that even in places with obstacles to voting, people still make the effort. This resilience adds another layer to the paradox. The harder it is to vote, the more some people feel motivated to do it, even though their individual impact remains small. The paradox of voting remains unsolved because it challenges how we think about rationality, decision-making, and human behavior. It shows that people do things for reasons beyond self-interest. It suggests that duty, identity, habit, and psychology all play a role in decisions that seem irrational on the surface. Millions of people will continue to vote even though their single ballot is unlikely to decide an election. The question is not why they vote, but rather why they believe it matters. Imagine a world where everyone is happy, not overjoyed, not in constant bliss, but content. People have decent lives, meaningful relationships, and enough resources to meet their needs. This seems like a good thing. Now imagine adding more people to this world. People who are also happy, though not as happy as those who were already there. Their lives are worth living, just not as fulfilling. The world now has more people, and in total, there is more happiness. If adding happy people makes the world better, it seems logical to keep going, adding more and more people as long as their lives are still worth living. But at a certain point, something strange happens. The original people, the ones who started with higher happiness, have to adjust. Resources get stretched thinner. Space becomes more limited. The things that once made life special get diluted as more people share them. As the population grows, average happiness starts to drop. No one is miserable, but no one is thriving either. Eventually, the world reaches a state where everyone is just barely happy, and yet, from the perspective of total happiness, this is the best possible world. This is the mere addition paradox. It challenges the idea that more happiness always makes things better. If each added person has a life worth living, adding them should not make the world worse. But when repeated enough times, this process leads to a result that feels wrong. A world where everyone is barely happy, but no one would choose it over a world with fewer, happier people. The paradox forces a difficult question. Should we always aim for a world with the most happiness, even if that means no one experiences a truly fulfilling life? To see how this works, imagine a small town where everyone is happy. They have strong communities, meaningful work, and time for leisure. Now imagine a new group of people moves in. These newcomers also live decent lives, just not as rich as those who came before. The town expands, housing becomes tighter, job opportunities spread thinner, and public services stretch to meet growing demand. No one suffers, but life becomes slightly less satisfying for everyone. More people means more total happiness, so it seems like a good thing. But over time, this process repeats. The town keeps growing, new people keep arriving, and each new person has slightly less than the last. The town that was once full of fulfilled people becomes a place where everyone is getting by, but no one is thriving. The town has more total happiness than before, but does it actually feel like a better place to live? This paradox plays out in different ways. Consider how cities develop. A small, vibrant community grows into a large metropolis. In the early stages, growth benefits everyone. More businesses open, cultural life thrives, and opportunities increase. But as the city keeps expanding, new arrivals face higher costs of living, more competition, and longer commutes. At some point, what was once an exciting place to live becomes crowded, expensive, and exhausting. No one wants to leave because life is still decent. But the city is no longer what it was. The same logic applies at a global scale. Adding people increases total happiness, but each new addition might slightly reduce the quality of life for everyone else. Philosopher Derek Parfit introduced this paradox to challenge assumptions about population ethics. It highlights a flaw in the idea that maximizing total happiness is always the best goal. If more happy people make the world better, the logic suggests we should keep adding people until everyone is just barely happy. That seems wrong, but it follows directly from the idea that more happiness is always good. It raises tough ethical questions. Should we prioritize a smaller population with richer lives, or a larger one where everyone is just getting by? If a life is worth living, does that mean creating it is always good? And if adding one more person does not make the world worse, how does adding millions lead to a bad outcome? One way to understand the paradox is by looking at individual choices. Imagine a couple deciding whether to have a child. They are happy and they know their child would have a good life, though perhaps not as happy as their own. It seems like a good decision. Now imagine every couple in the world makes the same choice. Over time, the world fills with more and more people, each one living a life that is still good, but slightly less fulfilling than the generation before. No single decision was bad, but the result is a world where everyone is only barely happy. If each choice was reasonable, how did they add up to something that feels so wrong? The paradox also applies to economic growth. Societies aim for progress, believing that more wealth leads to better lives. If economic growth means more people can live good lives, it seems like a goal worth pursuing. But if growth leads to overcrowding, environmental stress, and declining quality of life, does the increase in total happiness justify the trade-off? Many people would say no, yet the logic of maximizing happiness suggests otherwise. Another example comes from social policies. Governments often aim to improve overall well-being by expanding access to education, healthcare, and public resources. In the short term, this raises happiness. But if these policies encourage population growth without increasing resources, they might lead to a world where everyone has access, but no one has enough. No one suffers, but no one thrives either. Policies that seem beneficial when applied to individuals can lead to troubling outcomes when scaled up. The paradox does not have an easy solution. It shows how following simple moral principles can lead to unexpected and counterintuitive results. If more happiness is always better, the logic demands endless expansion, even if that means no one is deeply happy. If we reject that idea, we need a different way to measure what makes a world good. One alternative is focusing on average happiness rather than total happiness. That would avoid the problem of endlessly adding people with lower well-being. But it creates new problems. If average happiness matters most, would it be better to eliminate those whose lives bring down the average? That seems even worse than the paradox itself. Some argue that quality of life matters more than quantity. A smaller world with deeply fulfilled people might be better than a larger one with shallow happiness. But that raises difficult trade-offs. If a life is worth living, is it right to prevent it from existing? The paradox does not just apply to large-scale policies. It touches on everyday choices. It forces people to ask what kind of world they want to live in. Should society aim for the most happiness possible, even if that means no one is truly satisfied? Or should it accept limits to growth in order to preserve richer experiences for those who exist? These questions have no easy answers, but they matter in shaping decisions about the future. The repugnant conclusion challenges how we think about happiness and population. It asks whether a large world where people live barely happy lives is better than a smaller world where people are deeply happy. The idea seems strange, but logic in ethics and economics pushes toward it. Imagine a simple scenario. A world exists with 10 million people. Each person experiences life at an extremely high level of happiness. They are fulfilled, have strong relationships, enjoy their work, and face few hardships. Now, imagine another world with 100 billion people. Each person in this world is only slightly happy. Their lives are not miserable, but they lack deep fulfillment. They wake up, go to work, eat, sleep, and repeat without major suffering, but also without much joy. At first, most people would prefer the first world. It seems better to have a smaller number of people with deep happiness than a massive number of people with just a small amount of joy. But if we assume that happiness is something that can be added up across people, then the second world has more total happiness. 100 billion people, each experiencing even a small amount of joy, could create a world with much more overall happiness than a world where a smaller number of people are deeply happy. This idea is where the paradox appears. Most moral frameworks suggest that increasing happiness is good. If we accept that idea, then it follows that a world with more happiness, no matter how thinly spread, is better than a world with less happiness. But this conclusion feels wrong. It suggests that it would be acceptable to reduce the quality of life for people, as long as the total number of people increases enough to make up for it. This is why philosopher Derek Parfit called it the repugnant conclusion. It forces people to consider a possibility that seems intuitively unacceptable. A key issue with this paradox is how happiness is measured. If happiness is simply the sum of individual experiences, then increasing the number of people always increases total happiness, even if individual lives become less fulfilling. But if happiness is measured in terms of the quality of experience rather than the total amount, then a smaller world with deeply happy people may be preferable. The question becomes whether happiness should be maximized in quantity or quality. To make this clearer, consider a more extreme case. Suppose we could create a world with 1 trillion people, but each person lives just above the level of suffering. Their lives are not unbearable, but they are dull, repetitive, and lack meaning. They work long hours, have limited freedom, and experience few pleasures. Would this world be better than a world where only a few million people live incredibly rich and fulfilling lives? The logic of maximizing happiness in total suggests that it would be, but most people instinctively reject this idea. One way to challenge the repugnant conclusion is to argue that happiness cannot be added up in this way. Some philosophers suggest that happiness should be considered in terms of thresholds. In this view, a good life must meet a certain standard of well-being before it can be counted as contributing to overall happiness. If most people in a given world live lives that do not reach this standard, then it does not matter how many of them exist, the world is not better. Another challenge comes from considering fairness. If a society forces individuals to live with minimal happiness just to create a higher total amount of happiness, it might be violating principles of justice. People in the more crowded, less happy world could argue that their existence was forced upon them for the sake of a mathematical calculation. This raises ethical concerns about whether increasing the number of people should ever come at the cost of lowering the quality of life. This paradox also affects real-world policies. Governments and economists often think about well-being in terms of averages or totals. Some policies aim to improve total well-being, even if it means lowering the quality of life for some people. For example, policies that focus purely on economic growth may prioritize increasing the number of jobs over improving working conditions. If more people are employed but wages stay low and working hours remain long, is society really better off? The repugnant conclusion suggests that decisions like these may lead to unintended consequences. The paradox also appears in discussions about population ethics. If more people being born adds to the total amount of happiness in the world, then it would seem that policies should encourage high birth rates. But this logic can lead to a world where resources are stretched thin and individual quality of life declines. At what point does adding more people stop being a good idea? Should we aim for a balance between population size and quality of life? Technology adds another layer to this problem. Advancements in medicine and agriculture make it easier to support large populations. This means that in the future, we may face real decisions about whether to prioritize increasing population or improving quality of life. If we have the ability to sustain more people at a basic level of happiness, should we? Or should we focus on making sure that people live meaningful, fulfilling lives, even if it means keeping population growth in check? Some thinkers suggest alternative approaches. One idea is that happiness should be distributed in a way that avoids extreme inequalities. Instead of focusing on the total amount of happiness, we could focus on reducing suffering first. This would mean that a world where a few people live in extreme happiness while most live in near misery would be unacceptable. Instead, the goal would be to make sure that everyone reaches a reasonable level of well-being before thinking about total happiness. Another approach is to rethink what makes a good life. If fulfillment, meaning, and deep relationships matter more than simple pleasure, then we should aim for a world where people have those experiences, rather than simply maximizing the number of people who experience small amounts of happiness. This would mean prioritizing policies and choices that improve the richness of individual experiences, rather than just increasing population size. Even though the repugnant conclusion presents a disturbing scenario, it forces people to think about important questions. It challenges the assumption that more happiness is always better. It raises concerns about fairness and justice in ethical decisions. It also has implications for real-world policies about population, economics, and social well-being. The paradox does not offer easy answers, but it highlights the complexity of moral reasoning and the need to carefully consider the impact of different values on how we make decisions. A trolley is speeding down the tracks, out of control. If it continues on its path, it will hit and kill 5 people who are tied to the rails. You stand next to a lever. Pulling it will redirect the trolley onto a side track where one person is tied down. You face a decision: do nothing and allow the trolley to kill 5 people, or pull the lever and redirect it, actively causing the death of one person instead. This dilemma has troubled philosophers and ethicists for decades. The logic seems straightforward at first. Killing one person to save 5 sounds like the morally correct choice. But then the scenario shifts. Suppose the one person tied to the tracks on the alternative path is actually the person who caused the trolley to go out of control in the first place. Maybe they sabotaged the brakes or set the trolley in motion as an act of destruction. In that case, if you pull the lever, are you still making a moral decision? Or are you simply following through on a consequence that was already set in motion by that very person's actions? This version of the problem raises deeper questions about responsibility, justice, and intervention. In one way of thinking, your choice remains the same. The numbers don't change. 5 people will die if you do nothing. 1 person will die if you act. The moral weight of that decision seems unchanged. But now, your action also aligns with a kind of poetic justice. The person responsible for the runaway trolley ends up being the only one killed by it. If you do nothing, they succeed in their act of destruction, taking 5 lives instead of their own. The situation becomes more complicated when we think about intent. In moral philosophy, there's a difference between killing and letting die. If you refuse to pull the lever, you aren't actively killing anyone. You are simply not interfering. The deaths of the 5 people happen because of the trolley, not because of your choice. However, pulling the lever means you are directly causing the death of the one person on the sidetrack. Even if that person is responsible for the runaway trolley, you are the one making the final decision that seals their fate. That raises an uncomfortable question. If killing 1 person to save 5 is justified, does that change when the person who dies is guilty, or does it make the decision easier? Consider another layer to the problem. What if the one person tied to the tracks is not just responsible for the runaway trolley, but had no intention of causing harm? Maybe they were trying to stop the trolley, but in doing so, they accidentally triggered its acceleration. Maybe they tripped and fell onto the tracks while trying to save others. Now pulling the lever means you are punishing someone for an accident. The moral clarity of the situation starts to blur. The assumption that their death is a form of justice no longer holds. The scenario also brings up the idea of proportionality. Justice systems operate on the belief that punishment should fit the crime. If someone intentionally caused harm, society generally agrees they should be held accountable. But does accountability mean death? If the person on the alternate track had committed a serious crime in the past, does that justify your decision to pull the lever? What if the crime was minor? What if they had no idea their actions would lead to the trolley going out of control? These details shift the balance of the choice, making it less about numbers and more about judgment. This version of the trolley problem also forces us to confront our own biases. If we know nothing about the 5 people on the main track, we assume they are innocent bystanders. We don't stop to consider who they are, what they have done, or whether they deserve to be saved. But the moment we introduce moral responsibility into the equation, by making the one person on the other track the cause of the disaster, our perception of fairness shifts. The problem stops being about pure mathematics and starts being about individual worth. In practical terms, these kinds of moral dilemmas appear in real-world situations. Doctors often face decisions about how to allocate limited medical resources. If 2 patients need a ventilator, but only one is available, who gets it? A patient who has a long life ahead, or one who made choices that worsened their condition? In war, commanders make decisions about whether to sacrifice a few soldiers to save many. Policymakers weigh the lives lost in potential disasters against the costs of prevention. These decisions are not just theoretical. They play out in hospitals, governments, and battlefields. Another way to look at the problem is through the lens of emotional detachment. Imagine a self-driving car that encounters an unavoidable crash. Its algorithm must decide whether to swerve and hit 1 pedestrian or stay its course and hit 5. If the person who would die in the swerve is responsible for the accident, perhaps they ran into the street and caused the situation, should that affect the algorithm's choice? Unlike a human, the algorithm won't hesitate or second guess. It will make a decision based on pre-programmed logic. The question is whether we, as the programmers, would factor moral responsibility into that logic. There's also an argument to be made that the problem itself creates a false sense of choice. It presents a scenario where only 2 options exist: let 5 die or pull the lever and kill 1. But in real life, people often find third options. Maybe you could run onto the tracks and untie people. Maybe you could signal the trolley to slow down. Maybe the problem itself is a trap, making you believe you must kill someone when another solution exists. The trolley problem forces us to examine the way we think about morality, action, and consequence. It shows how a simple shift in perspective, turning one of the victims into the cause of the crisis, can complicate what initially seemed like an easy choice. It also reveals how much our moral instincts rely on context. In its original form, the trolley problem asks us to choose between numbers. In this version, it asks us to consider intent, guilt, and justice. The challenge is that there is no objectively correct answer. Some will argue that 5 lives outweigh 1, no matter the circumstances. Others will say that guilt changes everything, making the death of the one person more justifiable. Some might argue that the decision itself is flawed, based on an artificial constraint that ignores alternative solutions. No matter the choice, the problem reminds us that morality is rarely simple. It is shaped by the details, the context, and the way we choose to interpret responsibility. Fitch's paradox of knowability starts with a simple idea. Every truth should, in principle, be knowable. That seems reasonable. If something is true, then it should be possible for someone somewhere at some time to discover it. But this idea leads to an unexpected contradiction. If all truths are knowable, then every truth must already be known. This does not match reality. People discover new truths all the time, and there are certainly things no one knows yet. This paradox raises deep questions about knowledge, truth, and the limits of human understanding. Imagine a simple truth, such as, there is a rock on the ground in the park. Right now, no one might be aware of this fact, but it is still true. The principle of knowability says that it should be possible for someone to find out about the rock. That makes sense. If someone walks through the park and looks down, they will see the rock and know the truth of its existence. But consider a different kind of truth, one that no one will ever check. Suppose that somewhere, in a distant and unvisited part of the universe, there is a planet with blue grass. That is either true or false, but no one has seen it. If all truths are knowable, then this fact about the planet should also be something that can be known. But what if no one ever goes to that planet? What if no one ever looks? This leads to a strange problem. To prove this, consider a statement like, "There is a truth that no one will ever know." This is either true or false. If it is false, then every truth can eventually be known. If it is true, then there is at least one truth that no one will ever know. But if all truths are knowable, then even this truth should be knowable, which contradicts the original statement. This logical contradiction forms the heart of the paradox. A way to think about this is to consider secrets. Suppose someone writes a number on a piece of paper, seals it in an envelope, and then destroys both the envelope and the paper. The number was a real truth, but no one will ever know what it was. If every truth must be knowable, this presents a problem. The number existed, but it is impossible to discover. The paradox suggests that in order for all truths to be knowable, either all truths must already be known, or there must be no unknown truths at all. That contradicts the everyday experience of people constantly learning new things. The paradox works through a simple reasoning process. First, assume that every truth is knowable. That means that for any statement that is true, there must be a possible way to know it. Next, take a truth that no one knows. If all truths are knowable, then it must be possible to learn that truth. But if it is possible to know it, that means someone must eventually discover it. If no one ever does, then the idea that all truths are knowable is false. If they do, then the truth was never unknown to begin with. This means that if all truths are knowable, then all truths must already be known. This reasoning seems strange because it forces an unrealistic conclusion. People clearly do not know everything. There are scientific facts that remain undiscovered. There are things in the universe that no one has ever seen or considered. If all truths are already known, then it should not be possible for new discoveries to happen. But discoveries do happen. People learn new things. This shows that not all truths are already known, which suggests that not all truths are knowable. One way to understand this paradox is by thinking about lost knowledge. Imagine an ancient civilization that wrote books on a material that decayed over time. These books contained historical records, stories, and scientific observations. If all truths are knowable, then the facts in those books should be possible to recover. But if the books have been completely destroyed, then their contents are lost forever. The truths in those books existed, but they can never be known again. This contradicts the idea that every truth is knowable. A real-world example comes from archaeology. People know that ancient civilizations existed, but many of their details remain unknown. There are lost languages that no one can read, forgotten customs that were never recorded, and entire cities that have been buried by time. If all truths were knowable, then everything about these civilizations should be discoverable. But some facts will never be found. The arrangement of pebbles on a street in an ancient town is a truth that existed, but it is lost forever. This suggests that the idea of universal knowability does not match reality. Some responses to the paradox argue that knowability should not mean that every truth must be known. Instead, it should mean that every truth could be known in principle. But this does not fully resolve the issue. Even if a truth is possible to know, if no one ever discovers it, then it remains unknown. If there are truths that will never be known, then the statement that all truths are knowable is still problematic. A different response is that the paradox only applies to a certain type of knowledge. Some truths depend on observation, while others are logical or mathematical. For example, the statement 2 + 2 is 4 is always true, and anyone who understands mathematics can know it. But a statement like, the first leaf that fell in a forest in 1000 BCE landed on a particular spot is also a truth, yet no one will ever know it. The paradox challenges the idea that every kind of truth should be treated the same way. A deeper implication of Fitch's paradox is that it affects the way people think about knowledge itself. If every truth must already be known, then learning would not be possible. If knowledge is always expanding, then there must be truths that are currently unknown. But if there are truths that no one will ever know, then not all truths are knowable. This means that the original idea that all truths are knowable is incorrect. The paradox highlights a tension between what people believe about knowledge and what logic suggests. On one hand, people assume that any truth could be discovered if enough effort is made. On the other hand, the paradox shows that this assumption leads to contradictions. If some truths will never be known, then the idea that all truths are knowable is false. If all truths are knowable, then they must already be known, which is also false. This paradox also raises questions about the limits of science. Science aims to uncover truths about the world, but there may be facts that no scientific method can ever reach. Events in the past that left no evidence, unobservable regions of the universe, and fleeting natural occurrences may all contain truths that are real but unknowable. This challenges the assumption that, given enough time and effort, all truths will eventually be discovered. Fitch's paradox forces a reconsideration of what it means for something to be knowable. If knowability means that a truth must eventually be discovered, then the paradox shows that not all truths can be knowable. If knowability only means that a truth could, in theory, be known, then it may not apply to truths that will never be investigated. Either way, the paradox reveals a fundamental issue with how people think about knowledge and discovery. Hempel's paradox, also called the Raven Paradox, challenges how we think about evidence and confirmation. It suggests that seeing something unrelated can support a statement that seems completely different. The paradox starts with a basic rule in logic. If a statement is true, then anything that contradicts it should be false. If the statement, "all ravens are black," is true, then anything that is a raven should be black. The logical opposite of this statement is that there exists a raven that is not black. If someone were to find a white raven, the original statement would be false. Now comes the strange part. Logically, the statement, "all ravens are black," is the same as, if something is not black, then it is not a raven. These two statements must always be true together or false together. That is just how logic works. If every raven in the world is black, then anything that is not black must also not be a raven. That is where the paradox begins to take shape. Suppose you see a green apple. A green apple is not black, and it is also not a raven. This observation matches the second statement. If something is not black, then it is not a raven. By this logic, every time you see a non-black object that is not a raven, you get more evidence that all ravens are black. This means that seeing a red book, a blue car, or a yellow banana should in some way confirm that all ravens are black. That idea seems absurd, but logically, it follows from the reasoning that the two statements are the same. Imagine you are a scientist trying to confirm that all ravens are black. You could go out and examine ravens. If every raven you find is black, that supports your claim. But according to this paradox, you could also sit in a room and look at non-black things. If none of them are ravens, then you are gathering evidence in favor of your statement without ever looking at a raven. That does not feel right, yet logic suggests it works. To understand why this is strange, think about how we normally gather evidence. If someone wants to prove that all swans are white, they look at swans. Finding many white swans strengthens the belief that all swans are white. But it would seem strange if someone tried to prove this by looking at red chairs and saying, "This chair is not a swan, and it is also not white, so this helps prove all swans are white." The method feels incorrect, yet the logic remains consistent. One way to see the problem is to consider how much evidence each observation provides. Finding a black raven gives strong evidence for the claim that all ravens are black. It directly confirms the statement. Seeing a green apple technically provides some evidence, but it is weak. The world contains an enormous number of non-black objects. Seeing just one more does not add much to our understanding. If someone only looks at non-black things, they will collect many examples, but those examples do not strongly confirm the claim. Another way to think about this paradox is to imagine a detective solving a case. Suppose the detective wants to prove that a suspect always wears black shoes. One way to test this is by checking the suspect's shoes every day. If the shoes are always black, that supports the claim. But now imagine the detective decides to check other people's shoes. Every time someone else is found wearing brown or white shoes, the detective writes it down as supporting evidence. This method seems ridiculous because those observations have nothing to do with the suspect. Yet, in a purely logical sense, they do offer a tiny amount of confirmation. Philosophers have debated whether this paradox truly matters. One view is that, while seeing a green apple does provide evidence for the claim, the amount of evidence is so small that it does not matter. In real life, we want strong evidence, not weak confirmations. A scientist who only looks at non-black objects without checking ravens would not be doing good research. This response suggests that the paradox is more of a curiosity than a real issue. Another perspective questions whether logic alone should determine evidence. Human reasoning does not always follow strict logical rules. People expect direct connections between evidence and claims. If logic leads to conclusions that feel absurd, maybe the logic needs adjustment. Some philosophers suggest that the problem comes from treating all types of evidence the same way. Looking at a raven should count more than looking at an apple. If the system gave different weights to different observations, the paradox would disappear. Others take the paradox seriously and argue that it reveals something important about how knowledge works. In science, every observation that does not contradict a theory supports it. If a scientist claims that all metals expand when heated, every experiment where metal expands strengthens that belief. But every time something that is not metal fails to expand, that also fits the theory. The challenge is deciding which pieces of evidence should count the most. The paradox also raises questions about probability. If a person has never seen a raven before, they do not know what color ravens usually are. In that case, seeing a black raven is useful information. But once someone has seen hundreds of black ravens, finding one more does not change much. The same applies to non-black objects. If someone has already seen millions of them and none are ravens, seeing another adds little value. One way to explore this idea further is to imagine a different world. Suppose there were very few objects in existence. Imagine a world with only 10 things in it. If someone examined 5 and found that none were ravens, that would be meaningful. But in a world with billions of objects, finding another non-black item does not move the needle. This suggests that evidence depends not only on logic, but also on how much is already known. The paradox also connects to statistics. In statistics, a hypothesis is tested by looking for counterexamples. If someone claims that all dogs bark, the best way to test that is by looking for a dog that does not bark. Finding many barking dogs helps, but it does not prove the rule. The same idea applies to the raven paradox. The best way to test whether all ravens are black is to look for a raven that is not black, not to look at non-black objects. Another interesting aspect of this paradox is that it challenges common sense. Most people would not say that looking at a green apple helps prove something about ravens. This suggests that logical rules do not always match intuition. It also raises questions about how humans learn. If people relied only on logic, they might accept conclusions that seem strange. Instead, human reasoning balances logic with experience. A possible solution is to focus on how people actually confirm statements. In everyday life, people do not look at everything. They focus on relevant examples. A birdwatcher who wants to confirm that all ravens are black does not check apples and chairs. They look at ravens. This practical approach avoids the paradox, even if the logic remains unresolved. Some researchers suggest that the paradox shows a flaw in the way logic treats statements about the world. In real situations, people rely on patterns, probabilities, and direct observation. Logic alone does not always provide the best way to understand evidence. This suggests that while the paradox is interesting, it may not apply to real decision-making. The paradox also appears in artificial intelligence. Machine learning algorithms use data to confirm patterns. If an AI model were designed purely on logical rules, it might consider green apples as evidence for black ravens. This could lead to mistakes in how AI understands the world. Real-world AI models solve this by focusing on relevant data rather than abstract logic. This paradox remains one of the more unusual puzzles in philosophy. It shows that even simple statements about the world can lead to unexpected results. It also highlights the challenge of defining what counts as evidence. While logical reasoning suggests one answer, practical reasoning often suggests another. The paradox of inquiry, also called Meno's paradox, questions how learning is possible. If you don't know something, you wouldn't know where to start looking. If you already know it, then there's no reason to search. This paradox comes from Plato's dialogue, Meno, where Socrates and Meno discuss the nature of knowledge and learning. Imagine a person searching for a lost object in an unfamiliar place. If they have no idea what it looks like or where it might be, they can't know when they've found it. They could walk past it without realizing. If they do recognize it, then they must have had some prior knowledge of it. This is the problem Socrates raises. How can we learn new things if we don't already have some knowledge of them? A similar problem appears when someone tries to learn a new language. If they don't understand a single word, how do they begin? Someone might say they can use a dictionary, but dictionaries define words using other words. If a person doesn't know any words in a language, they can't use definitions to understand meanings. Learning must start somewhere, but if knowledge is always built on previous knowledge, where does the process begin? Socrates suggests that knowledge isn't learned in the usual sense, but is instead recalled. He argues that the soul existed before birth and had knowledge of all things, but forgot them upon entering the body. Learning, then, is not discovering new things, but remembering what was once known. He demonstrates this idea by questioning a slave boy about geometry. The boy, with no formal education, answers a series of questions until he understands a geometric concept. Socrates claims this proves the boy had knowledge within him all along and only needed the right guidance to remember. Even outside of Plato's philosophy, the paradox remains an issue in education and research. If someone wants to study a new topic, they must start somewhere. Teachers design lessons to introduce new ideas gradually, building on what students already know. But this only shifts the problem. There must always be a first step, and that step must somehow work despite the paradox. A child learning to count doesn't understand numbers at first, but through repetition and examples, they begin to grasp the concept. The question remains whether they are truly discovering something new or simply recognizing patterns their brain was already wired to see. Artificial intelligence faces a similar challenge. Machine learning models require initial data to begin their training. A completely blank system with no input cannot develop intelligence. It must start with some framework or basic rules. The paradox suggests that even machines cannot learn from nothing. They need at least a starting point, much like a human needs some foundation of knowledge to build upon. Consider a person trying to understand the concept of justice. If they have no idea what justice is, how do they begin forming an idea? They might look at examples, comparing fair and unfair situations. But to recognize fairness, they must already have some idea of what fairness is. The paradox suggests that learning is either impossible or unnecessary. Either you already know what you are looking for, or you don't know enough to even start. This issue appears in scientific discovery as well. Researchers often explore the unknown, but they don't begin with no knowledge at all. They rely on theories, assumptions, and previous findings to guide their work. A scientist searching for a cure to a disease doesn't randomly test substances. They use knowledge of biology and chemistry to narrow their search. Even when studying entirely new phenomena, they must begin with some framework. This suggests that learning always requires a foundation, even if that foundation is vague or incomplete. In everyday life, people encounter this paradox when trying to solve problems. If someone loses their keys, they search familiar places first. If they had no idea where to look, searching would be overwhelming. They narrow down possibilities based on experience. This reflects how knowledge works in general. People don't start from absolute ignorance, but use what they already know to guide them. Some have argued that the paradox only appears to be a problem because it assumes knowledge must be absolute. In reality, people don't need perfect understanding to begin learning. They can start with incomplete or uncertain ideas and refine them over time. This is how scientific progress happens. theories evolve, mistakes are corrected, and knowledge deepens. Another way to resolve the paradox is by recognizing different levels of knowing. Someone might not know a specific fact, but have a general sense of where to look. A person might not know the answer to a riddle, but understand the type of thinking required to solve it. Learning often involves making connections rather than discovering something entirely new. The paradox also raises questions about curiosity. If people only search for what they already know, why do they explore the unknown? The drive to learn suggests that humans operate in a way that contradicts the paradox. People often investigate things they don't fully understand, guided by intuition, guesses, or partial knowledge. Philosophers have debated the implications of this paradox for centuries. It touches on the nature of knowledge, learning, and human cognition. Some believe it points to the existence of innate knowledge. Others argue it highlights how learning depends on prior experience. Regardless of the resolution, the paradox challenges assumptions about how people acquire and understand information. A writer spends years researching, thinking, and crafting their book. They check facts, refine arguments, and ensure each statement is as accurate as possible. By the time they finish, they believe every sentence is true. Yet, when they write the preface, they include a disclaimer: mistakes are inevitable. This is the Preface Paradox. The contradiction appears simple. The author believes every claim in the book is true, but also acknowledges that at least one of those claims must be false. This isn't just an issue of modesty. It reflects a fundamental problem with belief, knowledge, and certainty. Consider a historian who writes a book about an ancient civilization. They rely on primary sources, archaeological evidence, and academic studies. They cross-check details, review translations, and compare expert opinions. They make the best possible judgments based on available evidence. When the book goes to print, the historian believes every claim is accurate. But history is full of revision. New discoveries change what we think we know. A previously trusted source might turn out to be unreliable. A translation might introduce an error. Despite their best efforts, the historian recognizes that at least one mistake likely exists. This paradox extends beyond books. Scientists publish papers, trusting their calculations and conclusions. Yet they know that science evolves. Later research may reveal flaws in their methods or interpretations. A doctor diagnoses a patient based on current medical knowledge, believing the diagnosis is correct. At the same time, they know medical errors happen, even with careful analysis. An engineer designs a structure following all known principles, convinced it will stand, but they also acknowledge that undetected errors can exist. The Preface Paradox applies whenever people hold strong beliefs while accepting that human knowledge is imperfect. The paradox challenges how we think about belief. If someone believes each statement in a book is true, they should reject the possibility of errors. If they accept the likelihood of errors, they should doubt at least some statements. Holding both positions at once creates tension. How can someone rationally believe every claim while admitting that some must be wrong? One way to approach this problem is to separate individual beliefs from general expectations. The author's belief in each claim is specific. They think each statement, taken alone, is correct, but their expectation of errors is broad. They know that in any large work, human error is unavoidable. The contradiction arises because belief works differently at different levels. Probability helps clarify this distinction. Suppose a book has 10,000 statements. The author has checked every one and sees no obvious mistakes. Based on experience, they estimate that books of similar complexity contain errors in about 1% of statements. This means that, statistically, about 100 errors are likely present. At the same time, for each individual statement, the probability of it being wrong is low, perhaps much lower than 1%. This creates a rational gap. The author can reasonably believe each specific statement while knowing that in a large set, some errors almost certainly exist. The paradox also raises questions about certainty. People rarely hold absolute certainty about anything. Instead, they form beliefs based on available evidence and the likelihood of being right. This makes the Preface Paradox less about strict logic and more about practical reasoning. An author doesn't mean I am 100% sure of every statement when they say they believe their book is true. They mean, I have high confidence in each claim, but I recognize my own fallibility. This problem connects to broader issues in epistemology, the study of knowledge. Philosophers have long debated the limits of certainty. René Descartes sought absolute foundations for knowledge, doubting everything until he reached the certainty of, I think, therefore I am. Later thinkers, like David Hume, emphasized that most human knowledge is based on patterns and probabilities, not absolute proof. The Preface Paradox fits within this tradition. It shows how everyday beliefs contain contradictions when examined closely. The paradox also reveals how people handle uncertainty in daily life. A meteorologist predicts rain tomorrow based on weather models. They believe the forecast is accurate, but acknowledge that forecasts sometimes fail. A juror in a trial hears evidence and reaches a verdict, convinced of the defendant's guilt or innocence. Yet they accept that wrongful convictions happen. A financial analyst recommends an investment, trusting their data while knowing markets are unpredictable. In each case, the individual belief in a particular claim coexists with an awareness that errors occur. Writers face this issue directly when making corrections. Imagine an author receives feedback from reviewers. A historian's book might contain a mistranslated quote. A scientist's paper might have a miscalculated formula. An economist's argument might ignore an important variable. When errors are pointed out, the author revises their beliefs. This process highlights the paradox. Before seeing the correction, the author believed the original statement was true. Afterward, they recognize it was false. This means the author's belief system contained errors before the correction, exactly what the preface admitted was possible. This paradox also appears in legal systems. Courts rely on testimony and evidence to reach verdicts. Judges and jurors make decisions based on the best available information. The legal system operates on the assumption that verdicts are correct. Yet wrongful convictions happen. This creates a contradiction. Courts must treat each verdict as accurate while recognizing that some will be overturned. Religious and philosophical beliefs also encounter this issue. A theologian writes a book explaining their faith, believing each statement to be true. At the same time, they know that religious texts and interpretations have changed over centuries. A philosopher defends a moral theory, convinced of its logic. Yet they accept that ethical beliefs evolve. This pattern repeats across disciplines and cultures. Technology and artificial intelligence introduce new layers to the paradox. AI models are trained on vast data sets. Developers test them and believe the outputs are reliable. Yet they know AI can generate errors, biases, and unexpected results. A software engineer believes their code works as intended, but writes error-handling functions because they expect bugs. Cybersecurity experts create encryption methods they trust, yet they prepare for potential vulnerabilities. The paradox even affects personal decision-making. People make life choices based on what they believe is best. Someone might choose a career path, convinced it's the right decision, while knowing that people often regret career choices. A person in a relationship believes they have chosen the right partner, but recognizes that breakups and divorces happen. A traveler plans a trip, confident in their itinerary, while accepting that unexpected problems could arise. These examples show how the paradox operates beyond academic philosophy. The preface. Paradox highlights a core feature of human reasoning. People balance belief and doubt. They trust their knowledge while recognizing its limits. They make decisions with confidence, even when acknowledging they could be wrong. This paradox isn't just about books. It's about how people navigate a world where certainty is rare but necessary. The paradox of analysis questions how we define and understand concepts. When someone analyzes a concept, they aim to explain it in simpler terms or reveal something deeper about its meaning. But this leads to a problem. If the analysis is correct, then it shouldn't tell us anything we don't already know. If it tells us something new, then it must be wrong, because it means the original concept was incomplete or misunderstood. This paradox has challenged philosophers who study meaning, knowledge, and language. Imagine a simple case. Someone asks, "What is a bachelor?" A standard analysis would define a bachelor as an unmarried man. This definition seems correct because it captures the common understanding of the word. But if it is truly correct, it shouldn't teach us anything new. everyone who understands the word bachelor should already know it means an unmarried man. If someone finds this definition surprising or revealing, then something must have been missing in their original understanding. This is where the paradox arises. An analysis should explain something, but if it explains too much, it implies that the original concept was unclear or incomplete. Consider another example. Suppose someone asks for the definition of a triangle. A standard analysis would say that a triangle is a three-sided polygon. This definition works because it captures what people already know about triangles. But if this definition genuinely helps someone understand triangles better, it implies that their prior understanding was somehow deficient. If an analysis is purely correct, it should only restate what was already known. If it does more than that, it suggests that the original concept was flawed or incomplete. This creates a tension in how people analyze and define ideas. Philosopher G.E. Moore explored this paradox while studying ethical concepts. He argued that defining goodness in simpler terms is impossible because any attempt to analyze it either repeats what we already know or changes its meaning. If goodness means what maximizes happiness, then we either learn nothing new or we alter the meaning of goodness. This problem applies to many abstract ideas. If someone tries to analyze justice, beauty, or truth, they may face the same dilemma. Either they repeat what people already understand, or they introduce new elements that change the concept. The paradox becomes even more obvious in scientific and mathematical definitions. Take the concept of water. Scientists define water as H2O, meaning it is made of 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom. This definition provides a deeper scientific understanding of water, but it also changes how people think about it. Before chemistry, water was simply a clear liquid people drank and used for cleaning. The discovery that water is H2O gave new information that was not obvious before. If this analysis is correct, it means the original concept of water was incomplete. But if an analysis only states what was already known, then it is redundant. Another case where this paradox appears is in explaining intelligence. If intelligence is analyzed as the ability to solve problems, then the definition either confirms what people already believed or reshapes how they think about intelligence. If someone argues that intelligence also involves creativity and adaptability, then they are not just analyzing intelligence, but expanding its definition. This makes it unclear whether they are uncovering something already present in the concept or redefining it entirely. This paradox affects how people approach learning. When someone learns a new skill, they either refine what they already knew or gain entirely new insights. If a child learns that addition means combining 2 numbers to get a total, they are understanding something they might have already grasped intuitively. But if they learn that negative numbers also exist, they are not just analyzing addition, but expanding their mathematical understanding. The problem is distinguishing between clarifying what was already understood and genuinely adding something new. The same problem arises in moral discussions. If someone defines honesty as telling the truth, they are not offering much insight because this definition only states what people already assume. But if they define honesty as not misleading others even when telling the truth, they introduce a deeper idea. This raises the question of whether their analysis is revealing something implicit in the concept of honesty or changing its meaning. If they are merely stating what honesty already means, they should not need to explain it. But if they are teaching something new, then they are not just analyzing honesty, but altering it. This paradox also applies to common words that seem simple but have deeper meanings upon closer inspection. Consider the word game. A quick analysis might define a game as an activity with rules and goals. But board games, video games, and sports all fit this definition while being very different from each other. If an analysis of games includes competition, then cooperative games become an issue. If it includes fun, then work-like strategy games become a problem. Each attempt to analyze game either states something obvious or shifts how people think about games. Language itself complicates this paradox. Words change meaning over time. An analysis that was correct in one era may not be correct in another. If someone analyzes friendship as a close, trusting relationship between 2 people, This may work for personal friendships, but not for modern online friendships, which can be distant yet meaningful. The definition either states what people already accept or changes with new social developments. Legal definitions also struggle with this paradox. A law may define theft as taking someone's property without permission. This seems straightforward, but legal cases introduce complications. What if someone borrows something and forgets to return it? What if they believe they had permission? A legal analysis of theft must either reinforce what is already understood or expand the definition to cover new situations. This shows why legal arguments often involve debates over definitions rather than just facts. Philosophers and scientists continue to wrestle with this paradox in many fields. The challenge is determining whether an analysis simply restates what people already know or genuinely improves understanding. Some argue that good analyses should refine concepts rather than change them. Others believe that every analysis inevitably adds something new. This tension makes defining ideas more complex than it seems at first glance. Analyzing abstract concepts like knowledge, time, or consciousness runs into the same issue. If knowledge is defined as justified true belief, then debates arise over what counts as justification. If time is the measurement of change, questions arise about time in a universe without change. If consciousness is awareness of oneself, disagreements emerge over whether animals or artificial intelligence can be conscious. Each attempt to define these ideas either confirms what was already assumed or shifts how people understand them. This paradox explains why dictionary definitions are often frustrating. They seem to clarify words, but sometimes raise more questions. If someone looks up love and finds a deep feeling of affection, they may still wonder what deep means in this context. If they look up art and find the expression of human creativity, they might question whether AI-generated paintings count. Definitions and analyses often struggle to balance being clear without being overly simplistic. The paradox also affects education. Teachers must explain concepts in ways that students understand, while making sure they do not just restate what students already know. If an analysis is too basic, it is useless. If it is too complex, it risks redefining the concept instead of explaining it. The best explanations often walk a fine line between reinforcing what is already understood and expanding comprehension. Understanding this paradox can help people think more critically about language, learning, and definitions. It shows why analyzing even simple words can lead to deep debates and why philosophy continues to examine the nature of meaning. Definitions are not just about stating facts, they shape how people understand the world. The paradox of analysis reveals the hidden complexity behind what seems like a simple task, explaining what something means.